everything in the right place. It is more than 100 years ago, at the border of the wood, near a large lake, stood the old mansion. Deep ditches surrounded it on every side, in which reeds and bulrushes grew. Close by the drawbridge, near the gate, there was an old willow tree, which bent over the reeds. From the narrow pass came the sound of bugles and the trampling of horses' feet. Therefore, a little girl who was watching the geese hastened to drive them away from the bridge, before the whole hunting party came galloping up. They came, however, so quickly that the girl, in order to avoid being run over, placed herself on one of the high cornerstones of the bridge. She was still half a child and very delicately built. She had bright blue eyes and a gentle, sweet expression. But such things the Baron did not notice. While he was riding past the little goose girl, he reversed his hunting crop, and in rough play gave her such a push with it that she fell backward into the ditch. "Everything in the right place," he cried. "Into the ditch with you." Then he burst out laughing, for that he called fun. The others joined in. The whole party shouted and cried, while the hounds barked. While the poor girl was falling, she happily caught one of the branches of the willow tree, by the help of which she held herself over the water, and as soon as the Baron with his company and the dogs had disappeared through the gate, the girl endeavoured to scramble up. But the branch broke off, and she would have fallen backward among the rushes, had not a strong hand from above seized her at this moment. It was the hand of a pedlar. He had witnessed what had happened from a short distance, and now hastened to assist her. "Everything in the right place," he said, imitating the noble Baron, and pulling the little maid up to the dry ground. He wished to put the branch back in the place it had been broken off. But it is not possible to put everything in the right place, therefore he stuck the branch into the soft ground. "Grow and thrive if you can, and produce a good flute for them yonder at the mansion," he said. It would have given him great pleasure to see the noble Baron and his companions well thrashed. Then he entered the castle. But not the banqueting hall. He was too humble for that. No, he went to the servants' hall. The men servants and maids looked over his stock of articles and bargained with him. Loud crying and screaming were heard from the master's table above. They called it singing. Indeed, they did their best. Laughter and the howls of dogs were heard through the open windows. There they were feasting and revelling. Wine and strong old ale were foaming in the glasses and jugs. The favourite dogs ate with their masters. Now and then the squires kissed one of these animals, after having wiped its mouth first with the tablecloth. They ordered the pedlar to come up, but only to make fun of him. The wine had got into their heads, and reason had left them. They poured beer into a stocking that he could drink with them, but quick. That's what they called fun, and it made them laugh. Then meadows, peasants, and farmyards were staked on one card and lost. "Everything in the right place," the pedlar said, when he had at last safely got out of Sodom and Gomorrah, as he called it. "The open high road is my right place. Up there I did not feel at ease." The little maid, who was still watching the geese, nodded kindly to him as he passed through the gate. Days and weeks passed, and it was seen that the broken willow branch, which the pedlar had stuck into the ground near the ditch, remained fresh and green. It even put forth fresh twigs. The little goose girl saw that the branch had taken root, and was very pleased. The tree, so she said, was now her tree. While the tree was advancing, everything else at the castle was going backward, through feasting and gambling, for these are two rollers upon which nobody stands safely. Less than 6 years afterwards, the Baron passed out of his castle gate, a poor beggar, while the baronial seat had been bought by a rich tradesman. He was the very pedlar they had made fun of, and poured beer into a stocking for him to drink. But honesty and industry bring one forward, and now the peddler was the possessor of the baronial estate. From that time forward, no card-playing was permitted there. "That's a bad pastime," he said. When the devil saw the Bible for the first time, he wanted to produce a caricature in opposition to it, and invented card-playing. The new proprietor of the estate took a wife, and whom did he take? The little goose girl, who had always remained good and kind, and who looked as beautiful in her new clothes as if she had been a lady of high birth. And how did all this come about? That would be too long a tale to tell in our busy time, but it really happened, and the most important events have yet to be told. It was pleasant and cheerful to live in the old place now. The mother superintended the household, and the father looked after things out of doors, and they were indeed very prosperous. Where honesty leads the way, prosperity is sure to follow. The old mansion was repaired and painted, the ditches were cleaned and fruit trees planted, all was homely and pleasant, and the floors were as white and shining as a pasteboard. In the long winter evenings, the mistress and her maids sat at the spinning wheel in the large hall. Every Sunday the counsellor, this title the peddler had obtained, although only in his old days, read aloud a portion from the Bible. The children, for they had children, all received the best education. But they were not all equally clever, as is the case in all families. In the meantime, the willow tree near the drawbridge had grown up into a splendid tree, and stood there free, and was never clipped. "It is our genealogical tree," said the old people to their children, "and therefore it must be honoured." 100 years had elapsed. It was in our own days. The lake had been transformed into marshland. The whole baronial seat had, as it were, disappeared. A pool of water near some ruined walls was the only remainder of the deep ditches, and here stood a magnificent old tree with overhanging branches. That was the genealogical tree. Here it stood, and showed how beautiful a willow can look if one does not interfere with it. The trunk, it is true, was cleft in the middle from the root to the crown. The storms had bent it a little, but it still stood there, and out of every crevice and cleft, in which wind and weather had carried mould, blades of grass and flowers sprang forth. Especially above, where the large boughs parted, there was quite a hanging garden, in which wild raspberries and hart's-tongue ferns throve, and even a little mistletoe had taken root and grew gracefully in the old willow branches, which were reflected in the dark water beneath, when the wind blew the chickweed into the corner of the pool. A footpath which led across the fields passed close by the old tree. High up, on the woody hillside, stood the new mansion. It had a splendid view, and was large and magnificent. Its window panes were so clear that one might have thought there were none there at all. The large flight of steps which led to the entrance looked like a bower covered with roses and broad-leaved plants. The lawn was as green as if each blade of grass was cleaned separately, morning and evening. Inside, in the hall, valuable oil paintings were hanging on the walls. Here stood chairs and sofas covered with silk and velvet, which could be easily rowed about on castors. There were tables with polished marble tops, and books bound in morocco with gilt edges. Indeed, well-to-do and distinguished people lived here. It was the dwelling of the baron and his family. Each article was in keeping with its surroundings. "Everything in the right place" was the motto, according to which they also acted here. And therefore all the paintings which had once been the honour and glory of the old mansion were now hung up in the passage which led to the servants' rooms. It was all old lumber, especially 2 portraits, one representing a man in a scarlet coat with a wig, and the other a lady with powdered and curled hair holding a rose in her hand, each of them being surrounded by a large wreath of willow branches. Both portraits had many holes in them, because the baron's sons used the two old people as targets for their crossbows. They represented the councillor and his wife, from whom the whole family descended. "But they did not properly belong to our family," said one of the boys. "He was a peddler, and she kept the geese. They were not like Papa and Mamma. The portraits were old lumber and everything in its right place. That was why the great-grandparents had been hung up in the passage leading to the servants' rooms." The son of the village pastor was tutor at the mansion. One day he went for a walk across the fields with his young pupils and their elder sister, who had lately been confirmed. They walked along the road which passed by the old willow tree, and while they were on the road she picked a bunch of field flowers. Everything in the right place, and indeed the bunch looked very beautiful. At the same time she listened to all that was said, and she very much liked to hear the pastor's son speak about the elements and of the great men and women in history. She had a healthy mind, noble in thought and deed, and with a heart full of love for everything that God had created. They stopped at the old willow tree. As the youngest of the baron's sons wished very much to have a fruit from it, such as had been cut for him from other willow trees, the pastor's son broke a branch off. "Oh, pray do not do it," said the young lady, but it was already done. "That is our famous old tree. I love it very much. They often laugh at me at home about it, but that does not matter. There is a story attached to this tree." And now she told him all that we already know about the tree, the old mansion, the peddler, and the goose girl who had met there for the first time, and had become the ancestors of the noble family to which the young lady belonged. They did not like to be knighted, the good old people, she said. Their motto was, everything in the right place, and it would not be right, they thought, to purchase a title for money. My grandfather, the first baron, was their son. They say he was a very learned man, a great favourite with the princes and princesses, and was invited to all court festivities. The others at home love him best, but I do not know why. There seemed to me to be something about the old couple that attracts my heart. How homely, how patriarchal. It must have been in the old mansion, where the mistress sat at the spinning wheel with her maids, while her husband read aloud out of the Bible. They must have been excellent, sensible people, said the pastor's son. And with this, the conversation turned naturally to noblemen and commoners, from the manner in which the tutor spoke about the significance of being noble. It seemed almost as if he did not belong to a commoner's family. It is good fortune to be of a family who have distinguished themselves, and to possess, as it were, a spur in oneself to advance to all that is good. It is a splendid thing to belong to a noble family, whose name serves as a card of admission to the highest circles. Nobility is a distinction. It is a gold coin that bears the stamp of its own value. It is the fallacy of the time, and many poets express it, to say that all that is noble is bad and stupid, and that, on the contrary, the lower one goes among the poor, the more brilliant virtues one finds. I do not share this opinion, for it is wrong. In the upper classes, one sees many touchingly beautiful traits. My own mother has told me of such, and I could mention several. One day she was visiting a nobleman's house in town. My grandmother, I believe, had been the lady's nurse when she was a child. My mother and the nobleman were alone in the room, when he suddenly noticed an old woman on crutches come limping into the courtyard. She came every Sunday to carry a gift away with her. "There is the poor old woman," said the nobleman. "It is so difficult for her to walk." My mother had hardly understood what he said before he disappeared from the room and went downstairs in order to save her the troublesome walk for the gift she came to fetch. Of course this is only a little incident, but it has its good sound, like the poor widow's two mites in the Bible. the sound which echoes in the depth of every human heart, and this is what the poet ought to show and point out. More especially in our own time, he ought to sing of this. It does good. It mitigates and reconciles. But when a man, simply because he is of noble birth and possesses a genealogy, stands on his hind legs and neighs in the street like an Arabian horse, and says, when a commoner has been in a room, "Some people from the street have been here," there nobility is decaying. It has become a mask of the kind that Thespis created, and it is amusing when such a person is exposed in satire. Such was the tutor's speech. It was a little long, but while he delivered it he had finished cutting the flute. There was a large party at the mansion. Many guests from the neighborhood and from the capital had arrived. There were ladies with tasteful and with tasteless dresses. The big hall was quite crowded with people. The clergymen stood humbly together in a corner and looked as if they were preparing for a funeral. But it was a festival. Only the amusement had not yet begun. A great concert was to take place, and that is why the Baron's young son had brought his willow flute with him. But he could not make it sound, nor could his father, and therefore the fruit was good for nothing. There was music and songs of the kind which delight most those that perform them, otherwise quite charming. "Are you an artist?" said a cavalier, the son of his father. "You play on the flute. You have made it yourself. It is genius that rules. The place of honor is due to you." "Certainly not. I only advance with the time, and that of course one can't help. I hope you will delight us all with the little instrument, will you not?" Thus saying, he handed to the tutor the fruit, which had been cut from the willow tree by the pool, and then announced in a loud voice that the tutor wished to perform a solo on the flute. They wished to tease him. That was evident, and therefore the tutor declined to play, although he could do so very well. They urged and requested him, however, so long that at last he took up the flute and placed it to his lips. That was a marvelous flute. Its sound was as thrilling as the whistle of a steam engine. In fact, it was much stronger, for it sounded and was heard in the yard, in the garden, in the wood, and many miles round in the country. At the same time, a storm rose and roared, everything in the right place. And with this, the Baron, as if carried by the wind, flew out of the hall straight into the shepherd's cottage, and the shepherd flew. Not into the hall, thither he could not come, but into the servants' hall. Among the smart footmen who were striding about in silk stockings, these haughty menials looked horror-struck that such a person ventured to sit at table with them. But in the hall, the Baron's daughter flew to the place of honor at the end of the table. She was worthy to sit there. The pastor's son had the seat next to her. The two sat there as if they were a bridal pair. An old count, belonging to one of the oldest families of the country, remained untouched in his place of honor. The flute was just, and it is one's duty to be so. The sharp-tongued cavalier who had caused the flute to be played, and who was the child of his parents, flew headlong into the fowl-house. But not he alone. The flute was heard at the distance of a mile, and strange events took place. A rich banker's family, who were driving in a coach and four, were blown out of it, and could not even find room behind it with their footmen. Two rich farmers, who had in our days shot up higher than their own cornfields, were flung into the ditch. It was a dangerous flute. Fortunately it burst at the first sound, and that was a good thing, for then it was put back into its owner's pocket, its right place. The next day, nobody spoke a word about what had taken place. Thus originated the phrase, "to pocket the flute." Everything was again in its usual order, except that the two old pictures of the peddler and the goose girl were hanging in the banqueting hall. There they were on the wall, as if blown up there, and as a real expert said that they were painted by a master's hand, they remained there and were restored. everything in the right place, and to this it will come. Eternity is long, much longer indeed than this story. Grandmother. Grandmother is very old. Her face is wrinkled and her hair is quite white, but her eyes are like two stars, and they have a mild, gentle expression in them when they look at you, which does you good. She wears a dress of heavy, rich silk with large flowers worked on it, and it rustles when she moves. And then she can tell the most wonderful stories. Grandmother knows a great deal, for she was alive before father and mother. That's quite certain. She has a hymn book with large silver clasps in which she often reads, and in the book, between the leaves, lies a rose, quite flat and dry. It is not so pretty as the roses which are standing in the glass, and yet she smiles at it most pleasantly, and tears even come into her eyes. I wonder why Grandmother looks at the withered flower in the old book that way. Do you know? Why, when Grandmother's tears fall upon the rose and she is looking at it, the rose revives and fills the room with its fragrance. The walls vanish as in a mist, and all around her is the glorious green wood, where in summer the sunlight streams through thick foliage. And Grandmother, why, she is young again, a charming maiden, fresh as a rose, with round, rosy cheeks, fair, bright ringlets, and a figure pretty and graceful. But the eyes, those mild, saintly eyes, are the same. They have been left to Grandmother. At her side sits a young man, tall and strong. He gives her a rose, and she smiles. Grandmother cannot smile like that now. Yes, she is smiling at the memory of that day, and many thoughts and recollections of the past. But the handsome young man is gone, and the rose has withered in the old book, and Grandmother is sitting there, again, an old woman, looking down upon the withered rose in the book. Grandmother is dead now. She had been sitting in her armchair, telling us a long, beautiful tale, and when it was finished, she said she was tired, and leaned her head back to sleep a while. We could hear her gentle breathing as she slept. Gradually it became quieter and calmer, and on her countenance beamed happiness and peace. It was as if lighted up with a ray of sunshine. She smiled once more, and then people said she was dead. She was laid in a black coffin, looking mild and beautiful in the white folds of the shrouded linen, though her eyes were closed. But every wrinkle had vanished. Her hair looked white and silvery, and around her mouth lingered a sweet smile. We did not feel at all afraid to look at the corpse of her who had been such a dear, good grandmother. The hymn book, in which the rose still lay, was placed under her head, for so she had wished it, and then they buried Grandmother. On the grave, close by the churchyard wall, they planted a rose tree. It was soon full of roses, and the nightingale sat among the flowers and sang over the grave. From the organ in the church sounded the music and the words of the beautiful psalms, which were written in the old book under the head of the dead one. The moon shone down upon the grave, but the dead was not there. Every child could go safely, even at night, and pluck a rose from the tree by the churchyard wall. The dead know more than we do who are living. They know what a terror would come upon us if such a strange thing were to happen as the appearance of a dead person among us. They are better off than we are. The dead return no more. The earth has been heaped on the coffin, and it is earth only that lies within it. The leaves of the hymn book are dust, and the rose, with all its recollections, has crumbled to dust also. But over the grave fresh roses bloom, the nightingale sings, and the organ sounds, and there still lives a remembrance of old Grandmother with the loving, gentle eyes that always looked young. Eyes can never die. Ours will once again behold dear Grandmother, young and beautiful as when for the first time she kissed the fresh red rose that is now dust in the grave. Hold her. Danske. In Denmark there stands an old castle named Kronenberg, close by the Sound of Elsinore, where large ships, both English, Russian and Prussian, pass by hundreds every day. And they salute the old castle with cannons, boom, boom, which is as if they said, "Good day." And the cannons of the old castle answer, boom, which means, "Many thanks." In winter no ships sail by, for the whole sound is covered with ice as far as the Swedish coast, and has quite the appearance of a high road. The Danish and the Swedish flags wave, and Danes and Swedes say, "Good day," and "Thank you," to each other, not with cannons, but with a friendly shake of the hand, and they exchange white bread and biscuits with each other, because foreign articles taste the best. But the most beautiful sight of all is the old castle of Kronenberg, where Holger Danske sits in the deep, dark cellar into which no one goes. He is clad in iron and steel, and rests his head on his strong arm. His long beard hangs down upon the marble table, into which it has become firmly rooted. He sleeps and dreams, but in his dreams he sees everything that happens in Denmark. On each Christmas Eve, an angel comes to him and tells him that all he has dreamed is true, and that he may go to sleep again in peace. As Denmark is not yet in any real danger, but should danger ever come, then Holger Danske will rouse himself, and the table will burst asunder as he draws out his beard. Then he will come forth in his strength, and strike a blow that shall sound in all the countries of the world. An old grandfather sat and told his little grandson all this about Holger Danske, and the boy knew that what his grandfather told him must be true. As the old man related this story, he was carving an image in wood to represent Holger Danske, to be fastened to the prow of a ship, for the old grandfather was a carver in wood, that is, one who carved figures for the heads of ships according to the names given to them. And now he had carved Holger Danske, who stood there erect and proud, with his long beard, holding in one hand his broad battle-axe, while with the other he leaned on the Danish arms. The old grandfather told the little boy a great deal about Danish men and women who had distinguished themselves in olden times, so that he fancied he knew as much even as Holger Danske himself, who, after all, could only dream. And when the little fellow went to bed, he thought so much about it that he actually pressed his chin against the counterpane and imagined that he had a long beard which had become rooted to it. But the old grandfather remained sitting at his work and carving away at the last part of it, which was the Danish arms. And when he had finished, he looked at the whole figure, and thought of all he had heard and read, and what he had that evening related to his little grandson. Then he nodded his head, wiped his spectacles, and put them on, and said, "Ah, yes, Holger Danske will not appear in my lifetime, but the boy who is in bed there may very likely live to see him when the event really comes to pass." And the old grandfather nodded again, and the more he looked at Holger Danske, the more satisfied he felt that he had carved a good image of him. It seemed to glow with the colour of life. The armour glittered like iron and steel. The hearts in the Danish arms grew more and more red, while the lions, with gold crowns on their heads, were leaping up. "That is the most beautiful coat of arms in the world," said the old man. "The lions represent strength, and the hearts, gentleness and love." And as he gazed on the uppermost lion, he thought of King Canute, who chained great England to Denmark's throne, and he looked at the second lion and thought of Waldemar, who untied Denmark and conquered the Vandals. The third lion reminded him of Margaret, who united Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. But when he gazed at the red hearts, their colours glowed more deeply, even as flames, and his memory followed each in turn. The first led him to a dark, narrow prison, in which sat a prisoner, a beautiful woman, daughter of Christian IV, Eleanor Ulfeld, and the flame became a rose on her bosom. and its blossoms were not more pure than the heart of this noblest and best of all Danish women. "Ah, yes, that is indeed a noble heart in the Danish arms," said the grandfather, and his spirit followed the second flame, which carried him out to sea, where cannons roared and the ships lay shrouded in smoke, and the flaming heart attached itself to the breast of Heftfeld in the form of the ribbon of an order, as he blew himself and his ship into the air in order to save the fleet. And the third flame led him to Greenland's wretched huts, where the preacher, Hans Ijeda, ruled with love in every word and action. The flame was as a star on his breast, and added another heart to the Danish arms. And as the old grandfather's spirit followed the next hovering flame, he knew whither it would lead him. In a peasant woman's humble room stood Frederick VI, writing his name with chalk on the beam. The flame trembled on his breast and in his heart, and it was in the peasant's room that his heart became one for the Danish arms. The old grandfather wiped his eyes, for he had known King Frederick, with his silvery locks and his honest blue eyes, and had lived for him, and he folded his hands and remained for some time silent. Then his daughter came to him and said it was getting late, that he ought to rest for a while, and that the supper was on the table. "What you have been carving is very beautiful, grandfather," said she. "Holger Danske and the old coat of arms. It seems to me as if I have seen the face somewhere." "No, that is impossible," replied the old grandfather, "but I have seen it, and I have tried to carve it in wood, as I have retained it in my memory. It was a long time ago, while the English fleet lay in the roads, on the 2nd of April, when we showed that we were true, ancient Danes. I was on board the Denmark, in Stenebil's squadron. I had a man by my side whom even the cannonballs seemed to fear. He sung old songs in a merry voice, and fired and fought as if he were something more than a man. I still remember his face, but from whence he came, or whither he went, I know not, no one knows. I have often thought it might have been Holger Danske himself, who had swam down to us from Kronenberg to help us in the hour of danger. That was my idea, and there stands his likeness. The wooden figure threw a gigantic shadow on the wall, and even on part of the ceiling it seemed as if the real Holger Danske stood behind it, for the shadow moved. But this was no doubt caused by the flame of the lamp not burning steadily. Then the daughter-in-law kissed the old grandfather and led him to a large armchair by the table, and she and her husband, who was the son of the old man and the father of the little boy who lay in bed, sat down to supper with him. And the old grandfather talked of the Danish lions and the Danish hearts, emblems of strength and gentleness, and explained quite clearly that there is another strength than that which lies in a sword. And he pointed to a shelf where lay a number of old books, and amongst them a collection of Holberg's plays, which are much read and are so clever and amusing that it is easy to fancy we have known the people of those days who are described in them. "He knew how to fight also," said the old man, "for he lashed the follies and prejudices of people during his whole life." Then the grandfather nodded to a place above the looking-glass, where hung an almanac, with a representation of the Round Tower upon it, and said, "Tycho Brahe was another of those who used a sword, but not one to cut into the flesh and bone, but to make the way of the stars of heaven clear and plain to be understood. And then he whose father belonged to my calling, yes, he, the son of the old image-carver, he whom we ourselves have seen, with his silvery locks and his broad shoulders, whose name is known in all lands. Yes, he was a sculptor, while I am only a carver. Holger Danske can appear in marble, so that people in all countries of the world may hear of the strength of Denmark. Now, let us drink the health of Bertel." But the little boy in bed saw plainly the old castle of Kronenberg, and the sound of Elsinore, and Holger Danske far down in the cellar, with his beard rooted to the table and dreaming of everything that was passing above him. And Holger Danske did dream of the little humble room in which the image carver sat. He heard all that had been said, and he nodded in his dream, saying, "Ah, yes, remember me, you Danish people, keep me in your memory. I will come to you in the hour of need." The bright morning light shone over Kronenberg, and the wind brought the sound of the hunting horn across from the neighboring shores. The ships sailed by and saluted the castle with the boom of the cannon, and Kronenberg returned the salute, boom, boom. But the roaring cannons did not awake Holger Danske, for they meant only good morning and thank you. They must fire in another fashion before he awakes, but wake he will, for there is energy yet in Holger Danske. It was prepared. "I did not travel," said the third mouse. "I stayed in this country. That was the right way. One gains nothing by travelling. Everything can be acquired here quite as easily, so I stayed at home. I have not obtained what I know from supernatural beings. I have neither swallowed it, nor learnt it from conversing with owls. I have got it all from my reflections and thoughts. Will you now set the kettle on the fire? So, now pour the water in quite full up to the brim, place it on the fire, make up a good blaze, keep it burning, that the water may boil. It must boil over and over. There, now I throw in the skewer. Will the Mouse King be pleased now to dip his tail into the boiling water and stir it round with the tail? The longer the king stirs it, the stronger the soup will become. Nothing more is necessary, only to stir it." "Can no one else do this?" asked the king. "No," said the mouse. "Only in the tail of the Mouse King is this power contained." And the water boiled and bubbled as the Mouse King stood close beside the kettle. It seemed rather a dangerous performance, but he turned round and put out his tail, as mice do in a dairy, when they wish to skim the cream from a pan of milk with their tails and afterwards lick it off. But the Mouse King's tail had only just touched the hot steam when he sprang away from the chimney in a great hurry, exclaiming, "Oh, certainly, by all means, you must be my queen, and we will let the soup question rest till our golden wedding 50 years hence, so that the poor in my kingdom, who are then to have plenty of food, will have something to look forward to for a long time with great joy." And very soon the wedding took place. But many of the mice, as they were returning home, said that the soup could not be properly called soup from a sausage skewer, but soup from a mouse's tail. They acknowledged also that some of the stories were very well told, but that the whole could have been managed differently. "I should have told it so, and so, and so." These were the critics who are always so clever afterwards. When this story was circulated all over the world, the opinions upon it were divided, but the story remained the same. And, after all, the best way in everything you undertake, great as well as small, is to expect no thanks for anything you may do, even when it refers to soup from a sausage skewer. I.B. and Little Christina. In the forest that extends from the banks of the Gudnau in North Jutland a long way into the country, and not far from the clear stream, rises a great ridge of land which stretches through the wood like a wall. Westward of this ridge, and not far from the river, stands a farmhouse, surrounded by such poor land that the sandy soil shows itself between the scanty ears of rye and wheat which grow in it. Some years have passed since the people who lived here cultivated these fields. They kept 3 sheep, a pig, and 2 oxen. In fact, they maintained themselves very well. They had quite enough to live upon, as people generally have who are content with their lot. They even could have afforded to keep 2 horses. But it was a saying among the farmers in those parts, "The horse eats himself up, That is to say, he eats as much as he earns. Jeppe Jans cultivated his fields in summer, and in the winter he made wooden shoes. He also had an assistant, a lad who understood as well as he himself did how to make wooden shoes strong, but light, and in the fashion. They carved shoes and spoons, which paid well, therefore no one could justly call Jeppe Jans and his family poor people. Little Ib, a boy of 7 years old and the only child, would sit by, watching the workmen, or cutting a stick, and sometimes his finger, instead of the stick. But one day Ib succeeded so well in his carving that he made 2 pieces of wood look really like 2 little wooden shoes, and he determined to give them as a present to little Christina. And who was little Christina? She was the boatman's daughter, graceful and delicate as the child of a gentleman. Had she been dressed differently, no one would have believed that she lived in a hut on the neighbouring heath with her father. He was a widower, and earned his living by carrying firewood in his large boat from the forest to the eel pond and eel weir on the estate of Silkeborg, and sometimes even to the distant town of Randers. There was no one under whose care he could leave little Christina, so she was almost always with him in his boat, or playing in the wood among the blossoming heath, or picking the ripe wild berries. Sometimes, when her father had to go as far as the town, he would take little Christina, who was a year younger than Ib, across the heath to the cottage of Jeppe Jans, and leave her there. Ib and Christina agreed together in everything. They divided their bread and berries when they were hungry. They were partners in digging their little gardens. They ran and crept and played about everywhere. Once they wandered a long way into the forest and even ventured together to climb the high ridge. Another time they found a few snipes' eggs in the wood, which was a great event. Ib had never been on the heath where Christina's father lived, nor on the river. But at last came an opportunity. Christina's father invited him to go for a sail in his boat, and the evening before he accompanied the boatman across the heath to his house. The next morning, early, the 2 children were placed on the top of a high pile of firewood in the boat, and sat eating bread and wild strawberries, while Christina's father and his man drove the boat forward with poles. They floated on swiftly, for the tide was in their favour, passing over lakes formed by the stream in its course. Sometimes they seemed quite enclosed by reeds and water plants, yet there was always room for them to pass out, although the old trees overhung the water and the old oaks stretched out their bare branches as if they had turned up their sleeves and wished to show their knotty, naked arms. Old alder trees, whose roots were loosened from the banks, clung with their fibres to the bottom of the stream, and the tops of the branches above the water looked like little woody islands. The water lilies waved themselves to and fro on the river. Everything made the excursion beautiful, and at last they came to the great eel weir, where the water rushed through the floodgates, and the children thought this a beautiful sight. In those days there was no factory nor any town-house, nothing but the great farm, with its scanty bearing fields in which could be seen a few herd of cattle, and 1 or 2 farm labourers. The rushing of the water through the sluices and the scream of the wild ducks were almost the only signs of active life at Silkeborg. After the firewood had been unloaded, Christina's father bought a whole bundle of eels and a sucking pig, which were all placed in a basket in the stern of the boat. Then they returned again up the stream, and as the wind was favourable, 2 sails were hoisted, which carried the boat on as well as if 2 horses had been harnessed to it. As they sailed on, they came by chance to the place where the boatman's assistant lived, at a little distance from the bank of the river. The boat was moored, and the 2 men, after desiring the children to sit still, both went on shore. They obeyed this order for a very short time, and then forgot it altogether. First, they peeped into the basket containing the eels and the sucking pig. Then they must needs pull out the pig and take it in their hands, and feel it, and touch it. And as they both wanted to hold it at the same time, the consequence was that they let it fall into the water, and the pig sailed away with the stream. Here was a terrible disaster. Ib jumped ashore and ran a little distance from the boat. "Oh, take me with you!" cried Christina, and she sprang after him. In a few minutes they found themselves deep in a thicket and could no longer see the boat or the shore. They ran on a little farther, and then Christina fell down and began to cry. Ib helped her up and said, "Never mind, follow me. Yonder is the house." But the house was not yonder, and they wandered still farther over the dry, rustling leaves of the last year, and treading on fallen branches that crackled under their little feet. Then they heard a loud, piercing cry, and they stood still to listen. Presently the scream of an eagle sounded through the wood. It was an ugly cry, and it frightened the children. But before them, in the thickest part of the forest, grew the most beautiful blackberries, in wonderful quantities. They looked so inviting that the children could not help stopping, and they remained there so long eating that their mouths and cheeks became quite black with the juice. Presently they heard the frightful scream again, and Christina said, "We shall get into trouble about that pig." "Oh, never mind," said Ib. "We will go home to my father's house. It is here in the wood." So they went on, but the road led them out of the way. No house could be seen. It grew dark, and the children were afraid. The solemn stillness that reigned around them was now and then broken by the shrill cries of the great horned owl and other birds that they knew nothing of. At last they both lost themselves in the thicket. Christina began to cry, and then Ib cried too, and after weeping and lamenting for some time, they stretched themselves down on the dry leaves and fell asleep. The sun was high in the heavens when the two children woke. They felt cold, but not far from their resting place. On a hill, the sun was shining through the trees. They thought if they went there, they should be warm, and Ib fancied he should be able to see his father's house from such a high spot. But they were far away from home now, in quite another part of the forest. They clambered to the top of the rising ground and found themselves on the edge of a declivity, which sloped down to a clear, transparent lake. Great quantities of fish could be seen through the clear water, sparkling in the sun's rays. They were quite surprised when they came so suddenly upon such an unexpected sight. Close to where they stood grew a hazel bush, covered with beautiful nuts. They soon gathered some, cracked them, and ate the fine young kernels, which were only just ripe. But there was another surprise and fright in store for them. Out of the thicket stepped a tall old woman, her face quite brown, and her hair of a deep shining black. The whites of her eyes glittered like a Moor's. On her back she carried a bundle, and in her hand a knotted stick. She was a gypsy. The children did not at first understand what she said. She drew out of her pocket 3 large nuts, in which she told them were hidden the most beautiful and lovely things in the world, for they were wishing nuts. Ib looked at her, and as she spoke so kindly, he took courage and asked her if she would give him the nuts, and the woman gave them to him, and then gathered some more from the bushes for herself, quite a pocket full. Ib and Christina looked at the wishing nuts with wide-open eyes. "Is there in this nut a carriage with a pair of horses?" asked Ib. "Yes, there is a golden carriage with 2 golden horses," replied the woman. "Then give me that nut," said Christina, so Ib gave it to her, and the strange woman tied up the nut for her in her handkerchief. Ib held up another nut. "Is there in this nut a pretty little neckerchief like the one Christina has on her neck?" asked Ib. "There are 10 neckerchiefs in it," she replied, "as well as beautiful dresses, stockings, and a hat and veil." "Then I will have that one also," said Christina, "and it is a pretty one too." And then Ebe gave her the second nut. The third was a little black thing. "You may keep that one," said Christina. "It is quite as pretty." "What is in it?" asked Ib. "The best of all things for you," replied the gypsy. So Ib held the nut very tight. Then the woman promised to lead the children to the right path, that they might find their way home, and they went forward certainly in quite another direction to the one they meant to take. Therefore no one ought to speak against the woman, and say that she wanted to steal the children. In the wild wood path they met a forester who knew Ib, and by his help Ib and Christina reached home, where they found everyone had been very anxious about them. They were pardoned and forgiven, although they really had both done wrong and deserved to get into trouble. First, because they had let the sucking pig fall into the water, and secondly, because they had run away. Christina was taken back to her father's house on the heath, and Ib remained in the farmhouse on the borders of the wood near the great land ridge. The first thing Ib did that evening was to take out of his pocket the little black nut, in which the best thing of all was said to be enclosed. He laid it carefully between the door and the doorpost, and then shut the door so that the nut cracked directly. But there was not much kernel to be seen. It was what we should call hollow or worm-eaten, and looked as if it had been filled with tobacco or rich black earth. "It is just what I expected," exclaimed Ib. "How should there be room in a little nut like this for the best thing of all? Christina will find her 2 nuts just the same. There will be neither fine clothes or a golden carriage in them." Winter came, and the new year, and indeed many years passed away, until Ib was old enough to be confirmed, and, therefore, he went during a whole winter to the clergyman of the nearest village to be prepared. One day, about this time, the boatman paid a visit to Ib's parents, and told them that Christina was going to service, and that she had been remarkably fortunate in obtaining a good place with most respectable people. "Only think," he said, "she is going to the rich innkeeper's at the hotel in Herning, many miles west from here. She is to assist the landlady in the housekeeping, and if afterwards she behaves well and remains to be confirmed, the people will treat her as their own daughter." So Ib and Christina took leave of each other. People already called them the betrothed, and at parting the girl showed Ib the 2 nuts, which she had taken care of ever since the time that they lost themselves in the wood. And she told him also that the little wooden shoes he once carved for her when he was a boy and gave her as a present had been carefully kept in a drawer ever since. And so they parted. After Ib's confirmation, he remained at home with his mother, for he had become a clever shoemaker, and in summer managed the farm for her quite alone. His father had been dead some time, and his mother kept no farm servants. Sometimes, but very seldom, he heard of Christina through a postilion or eel seller who was passing. But she was well off with the rich innkeeper, and after being confirmed she wrote a letter to her father, in which was a kind message to Ib and his mother. In this letter she mentioned that her master and mistress had made her a present of a beautiful new dress and some nice underclothes. This was, of course, pleasant news. One day, in the following spring, there came a knock at the door of the house where Ib's old mother lived, and when they opened it, lo and behold, in stepped the boatman and Christina. She had come to pay them a visit and to spend the day. A carriage had to come from the Herning Hotel to the next village, and she had taken the opportunity to see her friends once more. She looked as elegant as a real lady, and wore a pretty dress, beautifully made on purpose for her. There she stood in full dress, while Ib wore only his working clothes. He could not utter a word. He could only seize her hand and hold it fast in his own, but he felt too happy and glad to open his lips. Christina, however, was quite at her ease. She talked and kissed him in the most friendly manner. Even afterwards, when they were left alone, and she asked, "Did you know me again, Ib?" He still stood holding her hand and said at last, "You are become quite a grand lady, Christina, and I am only a rough working man. But I have often thought of you and of old times." Then they wandered up the great ridge and looked across the stream to the heath, where the little hills were covered with the flowering broom. Ib said nothing, but before the time came for them to part, it became quite clear to him that Christina must be his wife. Had they not even in childhood been called the betrothed? To him it seemed as if they were really engaged to each other, although not a word had been spoken on the subject. They had only a few more hours to remain together, for Christina was obliged to return that evening to the neighbouring village, to be ready for the carriage which was to start the next morning early for Herning. Ib and her father accompanied her to the village. It was a fine moonlight evening, and when they arrived, Ib stood holding Christina's hand in his as if he could not let her go. His eyes brightened, and the words he uttered came with hesitation from his lips, but from the deepest recesses of his heart. "Christina, if you have not become too grand, and if you can be contented to live in my mother's house as my wife, we will be married some day, but we can wait for a while." "Oh, yes," she replied. "Let us wait a little longer, Ib. I can trust you, for I believe that I do love you. But let me think it over." Then he kissed her lips, and so they parted. On the way home, Ib told the boatman that he and Christina were as good as engaged to each other, and the boatman found out that he had always expected it would be so, and went home with evening, and remained the night in the farmhouse. But nothing further was said of the engagement. During the next year, 2 letters passed between Ib and Christina. They were signed "Faithful till death." But at the end of that time, one day, the boatman came over to see Ib with a kind greeting from Christina. He had something else to say, which made him hesitate in a strange manner. At last it came out that Christina, who had grown a very pretty girl, was more lucky than ever. She was courted and admired by everyone, but her master's son, who had been home on a visit, was so much pleased with Christina that he wished to marry her. He had a very good situation in an office at Copenhagen, and as she had also taken a liking for him, his parents were not unwilling to consent. But Christina, in her heart, often thought of Ib, and knew how much he thought of her, so she felt inclined to refuse this good fortune, added the boatman. At first Ib said not a word, but he became as white as the wall, and shook his head gently, and then he spoke. Christina must not refuse this good fortune. "Then will you write a few words to her?" said the boatman. Ib sat down to write, but he could not get on at all. The words were not what he wished to say, so he tore up the page. The following morning, however, a letter lay ready to be sent to Christina, and the following is what he wrote. "The letter written by you to your father. I have read, and see from it that you are prosperous in everything, and that still better fortune is in store for you. Ask your own heart, Christina, and think over carefully what awaits you if you take me for your husband, for I possess very little in the world. Do not think of me or of my position. Think only of your own welfare. You are bound to me by no promises, and if in your heart you have given me one, I release you from it. May every blessing and happiness be poured out upon you, Christina. Heaven will give me the heart's consolation. Ever your sincere friend I be." This letter was sent, and Christina received it in due time. In the course of the following November, her banns were published in the church on the heath, and also in Copenhagen, where the bridegroom lived. She was taken to Copenhagen under the protection of her future mother-in-law, because the bridegroom could not spare time from his numerous occupations for a journey so far into Jutland. On the journey, Christina met her father at one of the villages through which they passed, and here he took leave of her. Very little was said about the matter to Ib, and he did not refer to it. His mother, however, noticed that he had grown very silent and pensive. Thinking as he did of old times, no wonder the 3 nuts came into his mind which the gypsy woman had given him when a child, and of the 2 which he had given to Christina. These wishing nuts, after all, had proved true fortune-tellers. One had contained a gilded carriage and noble horses, and the other beautiful clothes. All of these Christina would now have in her new home at Copenhagen. Her part had come true, and for him the nut had contained only black earth. The gypsy woman had said it was the best for him. Perhaps it was, and this also would be fulfilled. He understood the gypsy woman's meaning now. The black earth, the dark grave was the best thing for him now. Again years passed away, not many, but they seemed long years to Ib. The old innkeeper and his wife died one after the other, and the whole of their property, many $1,000s, was inherited by their son. Christina could have the golden carriage now, and plenty of fine clothes. During the 2 long years which followed, no letter came from Christina to her father, and when at last her father received one from her, it did not speak of prosperity or happiness. Poor Christina! Neither she nor her husband understood how to economize or save, and the riches brought no blessing with them, because they had not asked for it. Years passed, and for many summers the heath was covered with bloom. In winter the snow rested upon it, and the rough winds blew across the ridge under which stood Ib's sheltered home. One spring day the sun shone brightly, and he was guiding the plough across his field. The ploughshare struck against something which he fancied was a firestone, and then he saw glittering in the earth a splinter of shining metal which the plough had cut from something which gleamed brightly in the furrow. He searched, and found a large golden armlet of superior workmanship, and it was evident that the plough had disturbed a Hun's grave. He searched further, and found more valuable treasures, which Ib showed to the clergyman, who explained their value to him. Then he went to the magistrate, who informed the president of the museum of the discovery, and advised Ib to take the treasures himself to the president. "You have found in the earth the best thing you could find," said the magistrate. "The best thing?" thought Ib. "The very best thing for me, and found in the earth. Well, if it really is so, then the gypsy woman was right in her prophecy." So Ib went in the ferry boat from Aarhus to Copenhagen. To him, who had only sailed once or twice on the river near his own home, this seemed like a voyage on the ocean, and at length he arrived at Copenhagen. The value of the gold he had found was paid to him. It was a large sum, $600. Then Ib of the Heath went out and wandered about in the great city. On the evening before the day he had settled to return with the captain of the passage boat, Ib lost himself in the streets, and took quite a different turning to the one he wished to follow. He wandered on till he found himself in a poor street of the suburb called Christian's Haven. Not a creature could be seen. At last a very little girl came out of one of the wretched-looking houses, and Ib asked her to tell him the way to the street he wanted. She looked up timidly at him and began to cry bitterly. He asked her what was the matter, but what she said he could not understand. So he went along the street with her, and as they passed under a lamp, the light fell on the little girl's face. A strange sensation came over him as he caught sight of it. The living, breathing embodiment of little Christina stood before him, just as he remembered her in the days of her childhood. He followed the child to the wretched house, and ascended the narrow, crazy staircase which led to a little garret in the roof. The air in the room was heavy and stifling, no light was burning, and from one corner came sounds of moaning and sighing. It was the mother of the child who lay there on a miserable bed. With the help of a match, Ib struck a light and approached her. "Can I be of any service to you?" he asked. "This little girl brought me up here, but I am a stranger in this city. Are there no neighbors or anyone whom I can call?" Then he raised the head of the sick woman and smoothed her pillow. He started as he did so. It was Christina of the Heath. No one had mentioned her name to Ib for years. It would have disturbed his peace of mind, especially as the reports respecting her were not good. The wealth which her husband had inherited from his parents had made him proud and arrogant. He had given up his certain appointment and travelled for 6 months in foreign lands, and, on his return, had lived in great style and got into terrible debt. For a time he had trembled on the high pedestal on which he had placed himself, till at last he toppled over, and ruin came. His numerous merry companions and the visitors at his table said it served him right, for he had kept house like a madman. One morning his corpse was found in the canal. The cold hand of death had already touched the heart of Christina. Her youngest child, looked for in the midst of prosperity, had sunk into the grave when only a few weeks old, and at last Christina herself became sick unto death, and lay, forsaken and dying, in a miserable room, amid poverty she might have borne in her younger days, but which was now more painful to her from the luxuries to which she had lately been accustomed. It was her eldest child, also a little Christina, whom Ib had followed to her home, where she suffered hunger and poverty with her mother. "It makes me unhappy to think that I shall die and leave this poor child," sighed she. "Oh, what will become of her?" She could say no more. Then Ib brought out another match and lighted a piece of candle which he found in the room, and it threw a glimmering light over the wretched dwelling. Ib looked at the little girl and thought of Christina in her young days. For her sake, could he not love this child who was a stranger to him? As he thus reflected, the dying woman opened her eyes and gazed at him. Did she recognize him? He never knew, for not another word escaped her lips. In the forest, by the river Gudenau, not far from the heath, and beneath the ridge of land, stood the little farm, newly painted and whitewashed. The air was heavy and dark. There were no blossoms on the heath. The autumn winds whirled the yellow leaves towards the boatman's hut, in which strangers dwelt. But the little farm stood safely sheltered beneath the tall trees and the high ridge. The turf blazed brightly on the hearth, and within was sunlight, the sparkling light from the sunny eyes of a child, the bird-like tones from the rosy lips ringing like the song of a lark in spring. All was life and joy. Little Christina sat on Ib's knee. Ib was to her both father and mother. Her own parents had vanished from her memory, as a dream picture vanishes alike from childhood and age. Ib's house was well and prettily furnished, for he was a prosperous man now, while the mother of the little girl rested in the churchyard at Copenhagen, where she had died in poverty. Ib had money now, money which had come to him out of the black earth, and he had Christina for his own after all. In 1,000 years. Yes, in 1,000 years people will fly on the wings of steam through the air, over the ocean. The young inhabitants of America will become visitors of old Europe. They will come over to see the monuments and the great cities, which will then be in ruins, just as we in our time make pilgrimages to the tottering splendors of southern Asia. In 1,000 years they will come. The Thames, the Danube, and the Rhine still roll their course. Mont Blanc stands firm with its snow-capped summit, and the northern lights gleam over the land of the north. but generation after generation has become dust. Whole rows of the mighty of the moment are forgotten, like those who already slumber under the hill on which the rich trader, whose ground it is, has built a bench on which he can sit and look out across his waving cornfields. To Europe, cry the young sons of America, to the land of our ancestors, the glorious land of monuments and fancy, to Europe. The ship of the air comes. It is crowded with passengers, for the transit is quicker than by sea. The electromagnetic wire under the ocean has already telegraphed the number of the aerial caravan. Europe is in sight. It is the coast of Ireland that they see, but the passengers are still asleep. They will not be called till they are exactly over England. There they will first step on European shore, in the land of Shakespeare, as the educated call it, in the land of politics, the land of machines, as it is called by others. Here they stay a whole day. That is all the time the busy race can devote to the whole of England and Scotland. Then the journey is continued through the tunnel under the English Channel to France, the land of Charlemagne and Napoleon. Molière is named. The learned men talk of the classic school of remote antiquity. There is rejoicing and shouting for the names of heroes, poets, and men of science whom our time does not know. But who will be born after our time in Paris, the centre of Europe, and elsewhere? The air steamboat flies over the country whence Columbus went forth, where Cortez was born, and where Calderon sang dramas in sounding verse. Beautiful black-eyed women live still in the blooming valleys, and the oldest songs speak of the Cid and the Alhambra. Then, through the air, over the sea, to Italy, where once lay old, everlasting Rome. It has vanished. The Campagna lies desert. A single ruined wall is shown as the remains of St. Peter's, but there is a doubt if this ruin be genuine. Next to Greece, to sleep a night in the grand hotel at the top of Mount Olympus, to say that they have been there. And the journey is continued to the Bosphorus, to rest there a few hours and see the place where Byzantium lay, and where the legend tells that the harem stood in the time of the Turks. Poor fishermen are now spreading their nets. Over the remains of mighty cities on the broad Danube, cities which we in our time know not, the travellers pass, but here and there, on the rich sites of those that time shall bring forth. The caravan sometimes descends, and departs thence again. Down below lies Germany. That was once covered with a close net of railway and canals, the region where Luther spoke, where Goethe sang, and Mozart once held the sceptre of harmony. Great names shine there in science and in art, names that are unknown to us. One day devoted to seeing Germany, and one for the north, the country of Ørsted and Linnaeus, and for Norway, the land of the old heroes and the young Normans. Iceland is visited on the journey home. The geysers burn no more. Hekla is an extinct volcano, but the rocky island is still fixed in the midst of the foaming sea, a continual monument of legend and poetry. There is really a great deal to be seen in Europe, says the young American, and we have seen it in a week, according to the directions of the great traveller. And here he mentions the name of one of his contemporaries in his celebrated work, How to See All Europe in a Week. In the nursery, father and mother and brothers and sisters were gone to the play. Only little Anna and her grandpapa were left at home. "We'll have a play too," he said, "and it may begin immediately." "But we have no theatre," cried little Anna. "And we have no one to act for us. My old doll cannot, for she is a fright, and my new one cannot, for she must not rumple her new clothes." "One can always get actors if one makes use of what one has," observed Grandpapa. "Now we'll go into the theatre. Here we will put up a book, there another, and there a third, in a sloping row. Now 3 on the other side. So, now we have the side scenes. The old box that lies yonder may be the back stairs, and we'll lay the flooring on top of it. The stage represents a room, as everyone may see. Now we want the actors. Let us see what we can find in the plaything box. First the personages, and then we will get the play ready, one after the other. That will be capital. Here's a pipe head, and yonder an odd glove. They will do very well for father and daughter. But those are only 2 characters, said little Anna. Here's my brother's old waistcoat. Could not that play in our piece too? It's big enough, certainly, replied Grandpapa. It shall be the lover. There's nothing in the pockets, and that's very interesting, for that's half of an unfortunate attachment. And here we have the nutcracker's boots with spurs to them. Row, dow, dow, how they can stamp and strut. They shall represent the unwelcome wooer, whom the lady does not like. What kind of a play will you have now? Shall it be a tragedy or a domestic drama? A domestic drama, please, said little Anna, for the others are so fond of that. Do you know one? I know 100, said Grandpapa. Those that are most in favour are from the French, but they are not good for little girls. In the meantime, we may take one of the prettiest, for inside they're all very much alike. Now I shake the pen. Cockalorum. So now here's the play. Bryn, Bran, Span New. Now listen to the playbill. And Grandpapa took a newspaper and read as if he were reading from it The Pipe, Head and the Good Head, a family drama in 1 act. Characters: Mr. Pipe, Head, a father. Mr. Waistcoat, a lover. Miss Glove, a daughter. M.R. D.E. Boots, a suitor. And now we're going to begin. The curtain rises. We have no curtain, so it has risen already. All the characters are there, and so we have them at hand. Now I speak as Papa Pipehead. He's angry today. One can see that he's a coloured meerschaum. Snick, snake, snurre, basilure. I'm master of this house. I'm the father of my daughter. Will you hear what I have to say? Mr. de Boots is a person in whom one may see one's face. His upper part is of Morocco, and he has spurs into the bargain. Snicky, snicky, snake, he shall have my daughter. Now listen to what the waistcoat says, little Anna, said Grandpapa. Now the waistcoat's speaking. The waistcoat has a lay-down collar, and is very modest, but he knows his own value, and has quite a right to say what he says. I haven't a spot on me. Goodness of material ought to be appreciated. I am of real silk, and have strings to me. On the wedding day, but no longer, you don't keep your colour in the wash. This is Mr. Pipehead who is speaking. Mr. de Boots is watertight, of strong leather, and yet very delicate. He can creak and clank with his spurs, and has an Italian physiognomy. But they ought to speak in verses, said Anna, for I've heard that's the most charming way of all. They can do that too, replied Grandpapa, and if the public demands it, they will talk in that way. Just look at little Miss Glove, how she's pointing her fingers. Could I but have my love, who then so happy as Glove? Ah, if I from him must part, I'm sure 'twill break my heart. Bah! The last word was spoken by Mr. Pipehead, and now it's Mr. Waistcoat's turn. O Glove, my own dear, though it cost thee a tear, thou must be mine, for Holger Danske has sworn it. Mr. de Boots, hearing this, kicks up, jingles his spurs, and knocks down 3 of the side scenes. That's exceedingly charming, cried little Anna. Silence, silence, said Grandpapa. Silent approbation will show that you are the educated public in the stalls. Now Miss Glove sings her great song with startling effects. I can't see. Hey-ho! And therefore I'll crow. Kikeriki in the lofty hall. Now comes the exciting part, little Anna. This is the most important in all the play. Mr. Waistcoat undoes himself and addresses his speech to you, that you may applaud, but leave it alone. That's considered more genteel. I am driven to extremities. Take care of yourself. Now comes the plot. You are the pipehead, and I am the good head, Snap. There you go. Do you notice this, little Anna? Asked Grandpapa. That's a most charming comedy. Mr. Waistcoat seized the old pipehead and put him in his pocket. There he lies, and the waistcoat says, You are in my pocket. You can't come out till you promise to unite me to your daughter Glove on the left. I hold out my right hand. That's awfully pretty, said little Anna. And now the old pipehead replies, Though I'm all ear, very stupid I appear. Where's my humour? Gone, I fear, and I feel my hollow stick's not here. Ah, never, my dear, did I feel so queer. Oh, pray let me out, and like a lamb led to slaughter, I'll betroth you, no doubt, to my daughter. Is the play over already? Asked little Anna. By no means, replied Grandpapa. It's only all over with Mr. de Boots. Now the lovers kneel down, and one of them sings, Father, and the other, Come, do as you ought to do. Bless your son and daughter. And they receive his blessing and celebrate their wedding, and all the pieces of furniture sing in chorus, Clink, clanks, 1,000 thanks. And now the play is over. And now we'll applaud, said Grandpapa. We'll call them all out, and the pieces of furniture too, for they are of mahogany. And is not our play just as good as those which the others have in the real theatre? Our play is much better, said Grandpapa. It is shorter, the performers are natural, and it has passed away the interval before tea time, in the uttermost. Parts of the sea. Some years ago, large ships were sent towards the North Pole to explore the distant coasts and to try how far men could penetrate into those unknown regions. For more than a year, one of these ships had been pushing its way northward amid snow and ice, and the sailors had endured many hardships till at length winter set in and the sun entirely disappeared. For many weeks there would be constant night. All around, as far as the eye could reach, nothing could be seen but fields of ice, in which the ship remained stuck fast. The snow lay piled up in great heaps, and of these the sailors made huts in the form of beehives, some of them as large and spacious as one of the Huns' graves, and others only containing room enough to hold 3 or 4 men. It was not quite dark. The northern lights shot forth red and blue flames like continuous fireworks, and the snow glittered and reflected back the light, so that the night here was one long twilight. When the moon was brightest, the natives came in crowds to see the sailors. They had a very singular appearance in their rough, hairy dresses of fur, and riding in sledges over the ice. They brought with them furs and skins in great abundance, so that the snow houses were soon provided with warm carpets, and the furs also served for the sailors to wrap themselves in when they slept under the roofs of snow, while outside it was freezing with a cold far more severe than in the winter with us. In our country it was still autumn, though late in the season, and they thought of that in their distant exile, and often pictured to themselves the yellow leaves on the trees at home. Their watches pointed to the hours of evening, and time to go to sleep, although in these regions it was now always night. In one of the huts, 2 of the men laid themselves down to rest. The younger of these men had brought with him from home his best, his dearest treasure, a Bible which his grandmother had given him on his departure. Every night the sacred volume rested under his head, and he had known from his childhood what was written in it. Every day he read in the book, and while stretched on his cold couch, the holy words he had learnt would come into his mind. "If I take the wings of the morning and fly to the uttermost parts of the sea, even there thou art with me, and thy right hand shall uphold me." And under the influence of that faith which these holy words inspired, sleep came upon him, and dreams, which are the manifestations of God to the spirit. The soul lives and acts while the body is at rest. He felt this life in him, and it was as if he heard the sound of dear, well-known melodies, as if the breezes of summer floated around him, and over his couch shone a ray of brightness, as if it were shining through the covering of his snow roof. He lifted his head and saw that the bright gleaming was not the reflection of the glittering snow, but the dazzling brightness of the pinions of a mighty angel, into whose beaming face he was gazing. As from the cup of a lily, the angel rose from amidst the leaves of the Bible, and, stretching out his arm, the walls of the hut sunk down, as though they had been formed of a light, airy veil of mist, and the green hills and meadows of home, with its ruddy woods, lay spread around him in the quiet sunshine of a lovely autumn day. The nest of the stork was empty, but ripe fruit still hung on the wild apple tree, although the leaves had fallen. The red hips gleamed on the hedges, and the starling which hung in the green cage outside the window of the peasant's hut, which was his home, whistled the tune which he had taught him. His grandmother hung green bird's food around the cage, as he, her grandson, had been accustomed to do. The daughter of the village blacksmith, who was young and fair, stood at the well, drawing water. She nodded to the grandmother, and the old woman nodded to her, and pointed to a letter which had come from a long way off. That very morning the letter had arrived from the cold regions of the north. There, where the absent one was sweetly sleeping under the protecting hand of God. They laughed and wept over the letter, and he, far away, amid ice and snow, under the shadow of the angel's wings, wept and smiled with them in spirit, for he saw and heard it all in his dream. From the letter they read aloud the words of Holy Writ. "In the uttermost parts of the sea, thy right hand shall uphold me." And as the angel spread his wings like a veil over the sleeper, there was the sound of beautiful music and a hymn. Then the vision fled. It was dark again in the snow hut, but the Bible still rested beneath his head, and faith and hope dwelt in his heart. God was with him, and he carried home in his heart, even in the uttermost parts of the sea, Jack the Dullard. Far in the interior of the country lay an old baronial hall, and in it lived an old proprietor who had 2 sons, which 2 young men thought themselves too clever by half. They wanted to go out and woo the king's daughter, for the maiden in question had publicly announced that she would choose for her husband that youth who could arrange his words best. So these 2 geniuses prepared themselves a full week for the wooing. This was the longest time that could be granted them, but it was enough, for they had had much preparatory information, and everybody knows how useful that is. One of them knew the whole Latin dictionary by heart, and 3 whole years of the daily paper of the little town into the bargain, and so well, indeed, that he could repeat it all, either backwards or forwards, just as he chose. The other was deeply read in the corporation laws, and knew by heart what every corporation ought to know, and accordingly he thought he could talk of affairs of state, and put his spoke in the wheel in the council. And he knew one thing more. He could embroider suspenders with roses and other flowers and with arabesques, for he was a tasty, light-fingered fellow. "I shall win the princess." "So," cried both of them. Therefore their old papa gave to each of them a handsome horse. The youth, who knew the dictionary and newspaper by heart, had a black horse, and he who knew all about the corporation laws received a milk-white steed. Then they rubbed the corners of their mouths with fish oil, so that they might become very smooth and glib. All the servants stood below in the courtyard, and looked on while they mounted their horses, and just by chance the third son came up. For the proprietor had really 3 sons, though nobody counted the third with his brothers, because he was not so learned as they, and indeed he was generally known as Jack the Dullard. "Hallo," said Jack the Dullard, "where are you going?" "I declare you have put on your Sunday clothes. We are going to the king's court as suitors to the king's daughter. Don't you know the announcement that has been made all through the country?" And they told him all about it. "My word, I'll be in it too," cried Jack the Dullard, and his 2 brothers burst out laughing at him and rode away. "Father dear," said Jack, "I must have a horse too. I do feel so desperately inclined to marry. If she accepts me, she accepts me, and if she won't have me, I'll have her, but she shall be mine." "Don't talk nonsense," replied the old gentleman. "You shall have no horse from me. You don't know how to speak. You can't arrange your words. Your brothers are very different fellows from you." "Well," quoth Jack the Dullard, "if I can't have a horse, I'll take the billy goat who belongs to me, and he can carry me very well." And so said, so done. He mounted the billy goat, pressed his heels into its sides, and galloped down the high street like a hurricane. "Hey, hoop, that was a ride! Here I come!" shouted Jack the Dullard, and he sang till his voice echoed far and wide. But his brothers rode slowly on in advance of him. They spoke not a word, for they were thinking about the fine extempore speeches they would have to bring out, and these had to be cleverly prepared beforehand. "Hallo!" shouted Jack the Dullard. "Here am I! Look what I have found on the high road." And he showed them what it was, and it was a dead crow. "Dullard," exclaimed the brothers, "what are you going to do with that?" "With the crow? Why, I am going to give it to the princess." "Yes, do so," said they, and they laughed and rode on. "Hello, here I am again. Just see what I have found now. You don't find that on the high road every day." And the brothers turned round to see what he could have found now. "Dullard," they cried, "that is only an old wooden shoe, and the upper part is missing into the bargain. Are you going to give that also to the princess?" "Most certainly I shall," replied Jack the Dullard, and again the brothers laughed and rode on, and thus they got far in advance of him, but hallo, hop, rara, and there was Jack the Dullard again. "It is getting better and better," he cried. "Hurrah! It is quite famous." "Why, what have you found this time?" inquired the brothers. "Oh," said Jack the Dullard, "I can hardly tell you. How glad the princess will be." "Bah!" said the brothers, "that is nothing but clay out of the ditch." "Yes, certainly it is," said Jack the Dullard, "and clay of the finest sort. See, it is so wet, it runs through one's fingers." And he filled his pocket with the clay. But his brothers galloped on till the sparks flew, and consequently they arrived a full hour earlier at the town gate than could Jack. Now at the gate each suitor was provided with a number, and all were placed in rows immediately on their arrival, 6 in each row, and so closely packed together that they could not move their arms, and that was a prudent arrangement. For they would certainly have come to blows, had they been able, merely because one of them stood before the other. All the inhabitants of the country round about stood in great crowds around the castle, almost under the very windows, to see the princess receive the suitors, And as each stepped into the hall, his power of speech seemed to desert him, like the light of a candle that is blown out. Then the princess would say, "He is of no use. Away with him out of the hall." At last the turn came for that brother who knew the dictionary by heart, but he did not know it now. He had absolutely forgotten it altogether, and the board seemed to re-echo with his footsteps, and the ceiling of the hall was made of looking-glass, so that he saw himself standing on his head, and at the window stood 3 clerks and a head clerk, and every one of them was writing down every single word that was uttered, so that it might be printed in the newspapers and sold for a penny at the street corners. It was a terrible ordeal, and they had, moreover, made such a fire in the stove that the room seemed quite red-hot. "It is dreadfully hot here," observed the first brother. "Yes," replied the princess. "My father is going to roast young pullets today." "Bah!" There he stood, like a bar lamb. He had not been prepared for a speech of this kind, and had not a word to say, though he intended to say something witty. "Bah! He is of no use," said the princess. "Away with him!" And he was obliged to go accordingly. And now the second brother came in. "It is terribly warm here," he observed. "Yes, we're roasting pullets today," replied the princess. What were you? Were you pleased to stammered he, and all the clerks wrote down, "Pleased to "He is of no use," said the princess. "Away with him." Now came the turn of Jack the Dullard. He rode into the hall on his goat. "Well, it's most abominably hot here." "Yes, because I'm roasting young pullets," replied the princess. "Ah, that's lucky," exclaimed Jack the Dullard, "for I suppose you'll let me roast my crow at the same time?" "With the greatest pleasure," said the princess. "But have you anything you can roast it in? For I have neither pot nor pan." "Certainly I have," said Jack. "Here's a cooking utensil with a tin handle." And he brought out the old wooden shoe and put the crow into it. "Well, that is a famous dish," said the princess. "But what shall we do for sauce?" "Oh, I had that in my pocket," said Jack. "I have so much of it that I can afford to throw some away." And he poured some of the clay out of his pocket. "I like that," said the princess. "You can give an answer, and you have something to say for yourself. And so you shall be my husband. But are you aware that every word we speak is being taken down, and will be published in the paper tomorrow? Look yonder, and you will see in every window 3 clerks and a head clerk. And the old head clerk is the worst of all, for he can't understand anything." But she only said this to frighten Jack the Dullard, and the clerks gave a great crow of delight, and each one spurted a blot out of his pen onto the floor. "Oh, those are the gentlemen, are they?" said Jack. "Then I will give the best I have to the head clerk." And he turned out his pockets and flung the wet clay full in the head clerk's face. "That was very cleverly done," observed the princess. "I could not have done that, but I shall learn in time." And accordingly, Jack the Dullard was made a king, and received a crown and a wife, and sat upon a throne. And this report we have wet from the press of the head clerk and the corporation of printers, but they are not to be depended upon in the least. Little claws and big claws. In a village there once lived 2 men who had the same name. They were both called Claus. One of them had 4 horses, but the other had only 1, so to distinguish them, people called the owner of the 4 horses Great Claus, and he who had only 1, Little Claus. Now we shall hear what happened to them, for this is a true story. Through the whole week, Little Claus was obliged to plough for Great Claus, and lend him his 1 horse. And once a week, on a Sunday, Great Claus lent him all his 4 horses. Then how Little Claus would smack his whip over all 5 horses, they were as good as his own on that one day. The sun shone brightly, and the church bells were ringing merrily as the people passed by, dressed in their best clothes, with their prayer books under their arms. They were going to hear the clergyman preach. They looked at Little Claus ploughing with his 5 horses, and he was so proud that he smacked his whip and said, "Gee up, my 5 horses." "You must not say that," said Big Claus, "for only one of them belongs to you." But Little Claus soon forgot what he ought to say, and when anyone passed he would call out, "Gee up, my 5 horses." "Now I must beg you not to say that again," said Big Claus, "for if you do, I shall hit your horse on the head so that he will drop dead on the spot, and there will be an end of him." "I promise you I will not say it any more," said the other. But as soon as people came by, nodding to him and wishing him good day, he became so pleased and thought how grand it looked to have 5 horses ploughing in his field, that he cried out again, "Gee up, all my horses! I'll gee up your horses for you," said Big Claus. And seizing a hammer, he struck the one horse of Little Claus on the head, and he fell dead instantly. "Oh, now I have no horse at all," said Little Claus, weeping. But after a while he took off the dead horse's skin and hung the hide to dry in the wind. Then he put the dry skin into a bag and, placing it over his shoulder, went out into the next town to sell the horse's skin. He had a very long way to go and had to pass through a dark, gloomy forest. Presently a storm arose and he lost his way, and before he discovered the right path, evening came on, and it was still a long way to the town, and too far to return home before night. Near the road stood a large farmhouse. The shutters outside the windows were closed, but lights shone through the crevices at the top. "I might get permission to stay here for the night," thought Little Claus. So he went up to the door and knocked. The farmer's wife opened the door, but when she heard what he wanted, she told him to go away, as her husband would not allow her to admit strangers. "Then I shall be obliged to lie out here," said Little Claus to himself, as the farmer's wife shut the door in his face. Near to the farmhouse stood a large haystack, and between it and the house was a small shed with a thatched roof. "I can lie up there," said Little Claus as he saw the roof. "It will make a famous bed, but I hope the stork will not fly down and bite my legs, for on it stood a living stork whose nest was in the roof." So Little Claus climbed to the roof of the shed, and while he turned himself to get comfortable, he discovered that the wooden shutters, which were closed, did not reach to the tops of the windows of the farmhouse, so that he could see into a room in which a large table was laid out with wine, roast meat, and a splendid fish. The farmer's wife and the sexton were sitting at the table together, and she filled his glass and helped him plenteously to fish, which appeared to be his favourite dish. "If I could only get some too," thought Little Claus, and then, as he stretched his neck towards the window, he spied a large, beautiful pie. Indeed, they had a glorious feast before them. At this moment he heard someone riding down the road towards the farmhouse. It was the farmer returning home. He was a good man, but still he had a very strange prejudice. He could not bear the sight of a sexton. If one appeared before him, he would put himself in a terrible rage. In consequence of this dislike, the sexton had gone to visit the farmer's wife during her husband's absence from home, and the good woman had placed before him the best she had in the house to eat. When she heard the farmer coming, she was frightened, and begged the sexton to hide himself in a large empty chest that stood in the room. He did so, for he knew her husband could not endure the sight of a sexton. The woman then quickly put away the wine and hid all the rest of the nice things in the oven, for if her husband had seen them, he would have asked what they were brought out for. "Oh dear," sighed Little Claus from the top of the shed as he saw all the good things disappear. "Is anyone up there?" asked the farmer, looking up and discovering Little Claus. "Why are you lying up there? Come down and come into the house with me." So Little Claus came down and told the farmer how he had lost his way and begged for a night's lodging. "All right," said the farmer, "but we must have something to eat first." The woman received them both very kindly, laid the cloth on a large table, and placed before them a dish of porridge. The farmer was very hungry, and ate his porridge with a good appetite, but Little Claus could not help thinking of the nice roast meat, fish, and pies, which he knew were in the oven. Under the table, at his feet, lay the sack containing the horse's skin, which he intended to sell at the next town. Now, Little Claus did not relish the porridge at all, so he trod with his foot on the sack under the table, and the dry skin squeaked quite loud. "Hush!" said Little Claus to his sack, at the same time treading upon it again till it squeaked louder than before. "Hello! What have you got in your sack?" asked the farmer. "Oh, it is a conjurer," said Little Claus, "and he says we need not eat porridge, for he has conjured the oven full of roast meat, fish, and pie." "Wonderful!" cried the farmer, starting up and opening the oven door, and there lay all the nice things hidden by the farmer's wife, but which he supposed had been conjured there by the wizard under the table. The woman dared not say anything, so she placed the things before them, and they both ate of the fish, the meat, and the pastry. Then Little Claus trod again upon his sack, and it squeaked as before. "What does he say now?" asked the farmer. "He says," replied Little Claus, "that there are 3 bottles of wine for us standing in the corner by the oven." So the woman was obliged to bring out the wine also, which she had hidden, and the farmer drank it till he became quite merry. He would have liked such a conjurer as Little Claus carried in his sack. "Could he conjure up the evil one?" asked the farmer. "I should like to see him now, while I am so merry." "Oh, yes," replied Little Claus. "My conjurer can do anything I ask him. Can you not?" he asked, treading at the same time on the sack till it squeaked. "Do you hear?" he answers. "Yes, but he fears that we shall not like to look at him." "Oh, I am not afraid. What will he be like?" "Well, he is very much like a sexton." "Ha!" said the farmer. "Then he must be ugly. Do you know, I cannot endure the sight of a sexton. However, that doesn't matter. I shall know who it is, so I shall not mind. Now then, I have got up my courage, but don't let him come too near me." "Stop, I must ask the conjurer," said Little Claus, so he trod on the bag and stooped his ear down to listen. "What does he say?" "He says that you must go and open that large chest which stands in the corner, and you will see the evil one crouching down inside, but you must hold the lid firmly, that he may not slip out." "Will you come and help me hold it?" said the farmer, going towards the chest in which his wife had hidden the sexton, who now lay inside, very much frightened. The farmer opened the lid a very little way, and peeped in. "Oh!" cried he, springing backwards, "I saw him, and he is exactly like our sexton. How dreadful it is!" So after that he was obliged to drink again, and they sat and drank till far into the night. "You must sell your conjurer to me," said the farmer. "Ask as much as you like, I will pay it. Indeed, I would give you directly a whole bushel of gold." "No, indeed, I cannot," said Little Claus. "Only think how much profit I could make out of this conjurer." "But I should like to have him," said the farmer, still continuing his entreaties. "Well," said Little Claus at length, "you have been so good as to give me a night's lodging. I will not refuse you. You shall have the conjurer for a bushel of money, but I will have quite full measure." "So you shall," said the farmer, "but you must take away the chest as well. I would not have it in the house another hour. There is no knowing if he may not be still there. So Little Claus gave the farmer the sack containing the dried horse's skin, and received in exchange a bushel of money, full measure. The farmer also gave him a wheelbarrow on which to carry away the chest and the gold. "Farewell," said Little Claus as he went off with his money and the great chest, in which the sexton lay still concealed. On one side of the forest was a broad, deep river. The water flowed so rapidly that very few were able to swim against the stream. A new bridge had lately been built across it, and in the middle of this bridge Little Claus stopped, and said loud enough to be heard by the sexton, "Now what shall I do with this stupid chest? It is as heavy as if it were full of stones. I shall be tired if I roll it any farther, so I may as well throw it in the river. If it swims after me to my house, well and good, and if not, it will not much matter." So he seized the chest in his hand and lifted it up a little, as if he were going to throw it into the water. "No, leave it alone," cried the sexton from within the chest. "Let me out first." "Oh!" exclaimed Little Claus, pretending to be frightened. "He is in there still, is he? I must throw him into the river, that he may be drowned." "Oh no, oh no," cried the sexton. "I will give you a whole bushel full of money if you will let me go." "Why, that is another matter," said Little Claus, opening the chest. The sexton crept out, pushed the empty chest into the water, and went to his house. Then he measured out a whole bushel full of gold for Little Claus, who had already received one from the farmer, so that now he had a barrow full. "I have been well paid for my horse," said he to himself when he reached home, entered his own room, and emptied all his money into a heap on the floor. "How vexed Great Claus will be when he finds out how rich I have become all through my one horse, but I shall not tell him exactly how it all happened." Then he sent a boy to Great Claus to borrow a bushel measure. "What can he want it for?" thought Great Claus, so he smeared the bottom of the measure with tar, that some of whatever was put into it might stick there and remain. And so it happened, for when the measure returned, 3 new silver florins were sticking to it. "What does this mean?" said Great Claus, so he ran off directly to Little Claus and asked, "Where did you get so much money?" "Oh, for my horse's skin. I sold it yesterday." "It was certainly well paid for then," said Great Claus, and he ran home to his house, seized a hatchet, and knocked all his 4 horses on the head, flayed off their skins, and took them to the town to sell. "Skins, skins, who'll buy skins?" he cried, as he went through the streets. All the shoemakers and tanners came running, and asked how much he wanted for them. "A bushel of money for each," replied Great Claus. "Are you mad?" they all cried. "Do you think we have money to spend by the bushel?" "Skins, skins," he cried again. "Who'll buy skins?" But to all who inquired the price, his answer was, "A bushel of money." "He is making fools of us," said they all. Then the shoemakers took their straps, and the tanners their leather aprons, and began to beat Great Claus. "Skins, skins," they cried, mocking him. "Yes, we'll mark your skin for you till it is black and blue." "Out of the town with him," said they, and Great Claus was obliged to run as fast as he could. He had never before been so thoroughly beaten. "Ah," said he, as he came to his house, "Little Claus shall pay me for this. I will beat him to death." Meanwhile, the old grandmother of Little Claus died. She had been cross, unkind, and really spiteful to him, but he was very sorry, and took the dead woman and laid her in his warm bed to see if he could bring her to life again. There he determined that she should lie the whole night, while he seated himself in a chair in a corner of the room, as he had often done before. During the night, as he sat there, the door opened, and in came Great Claus with a hatchet. He knew well where Little Claus's bed stood, So he went right up to it and struck the old grandmother on the head, thinking it must be Little Claus. "There," cried he, "now you cannot make a fool of me again." And then he went home. "That is a very wicked man," thought Little Claus. "He meant to kill me. It is a good thing for my old grandmother that she was already dead, or he would have taken her life." Then he dressed his old grandmother in her best clothes, borrowed a horse of his neighbor, and harnessed it to a cart. Then he placed the old woman on the back seat, so that she might not fall out as he drove, and rode away through the wood. By sunrise they reached a large inn, where Little Claus stopped and went to get something to eat. The landlord was a rich man, and a good man too, but as passionate as if he had been made of pepper and snuff. "Good morning," said he to Little Claus. "You are come betimes today." "Yes," said Little Claus. "I am going to the town with my old grandmother. She is sitting at the back of the wagon, but I cannot bring her into the room. Will you take her a glass of mead? But you must speak very loud, for she cannot hear well." "Yes, certainly I will," replied the landlord, and, pouring out a glass of mead, he carried it out to the dead grandmother, who sat upright in the cart. "Here is a glass of mead from your grandson," said the landlord. The dead woman did not answer a word, but sat quite still. "Do you not hear?" cried the landlord as loud as he could. "Here is a glass of mead from your grandson." Again and again he bawled it out, but as she did not stir, he flew into a passion, and threw the glass of mead in her face. It struck her on the nose, and she fell backwards out of the cart, for she was only seated there, not tied in. "Hallo!" cried Little Claus, rushing out of the door and seizing hold of the landlord by the throat. "You have killed my grandmother, see? Here is a great hole in her forehead." "Oh, how unfortunate!" said the landlord, wringing his hands. "This all comes of my fiery temper. Dear Little Claus, I will give you a bushel of money. I will bury your grandmother as if she were my own. Only keep silent, or else they will cut off my head, and that would be disagreeable." So it happened that Little Claus received another bushel of money, and the landlord buried his old grandmother as if she had been his own. When Little Claus reached home again, he immediately sent a boy to Great Claus, requesting him to lend him a bushel measure. "How is this?" thought Great Claus. "Did I not kill him? I must go and see for myself." So he went to Little Claus and took the bushel measure with him. "How did you get all this money?" asked Great Claus, staring with wide-open eyes at his neighbor's treasures. "You killed my grandmother instead of me," said Little Claus. "So I have sold her for a bushel of money." "That is a good price at all events," said Great Claus. So he went home, took a hatchet, and killed his old grandmother with one blow. Then he placed her on a cart and drove into the town to the apothecary and asked him if he would buy a dead body. "Whose is it? And where did you get it?" asked the apothecary. "It is my grandmother," he replied. "I killed her with a blow, that I might get a bushel of money for her." "Heaven preserve us!" cried the apothecary. "You are out of your mind. Don't say such things, or you will lose your head." And then he talked to him seriously about the wicked deed he had done, and told him that such a wicked man would surely be punished. Great Claus got so frightened that he rushed out of the surgery, jumped into the cart, whipped up his horses, and drove home quickly. The apothecary and all the people thought him mad, and let him drive where he liked. "You shall pay for this," said Great Claus, as soon as he got into the high road. "That you shall, Little Claus." So as soon as he reached home, he took the largest sack he could find and went over to Little Claus. "You have played me another trick," said he. "First I killed all my horses, and then my old grandmother, and it is all your fault, but you shall not make a fool of me any more." So he laid hold of Little Claus round the body and pushed him into the sack, which he took on his shoulders, saying, "Now I'm going to drown you in the river." He had a long way to go before he reached the river, and Little Claus was not a very light weight to carry. The road led by the church, and as they passed he could hear the organ playing and the people singing beautifully. Great Claus put down the sack close to the church door, and thought he might as well go in and hear a psalm before he went any farther. Little Claus could not possibly get out of the sack, and all the people were in church, so in he went. "Oh dear," sighed Little Claus in the sack as he turned and twisted about, but he found he could not loosen the string with which it was tied. Presently an old cattle driver with snowy hair passed by, carrying a large staff in his hand, with which he drove a large herd of cows and oxen before him. They stumbled against the sack in which lay Little Claus and turned it over. "Oh dear," sighed Little Claus, "I am very young, yet I am soon going to heaven." "And I, poor fellow," said the drover, "I who am so old already, cannot get there." "Open the sack," cried Little Claus. "Creep into it instead of me, and you will soon be there." "With all my heart," replied the drover, opening the sack, from which sprung Little Claus as quickly as possible. "Will you take care of my cattle?" said the old man, as he crept into the bag. "Yes," said Little Claus, and he tied up the sack, and then walked off with all the cows and oxen. When Great Claus came out of church, he took up the sack and placed it on his shoulders. It appeared to have become lighter, for the old drover was not half so heavy as Little Claus. "How light he seems now," said he. "Ah, it is because I have been to a church." So he walked on to the river, which was deep and broad, and threw the sack containing the old drover into the water, believing it to be Little Claus. "There you may lie," he exclaimed. "You will play me no more tricks now." Then he turned to go home, but when he came to a place where two roads crossed, there was Little Claus driving the cattle. "How is this?" said Great Claus. "Did I not drown you just now?" "Yes," said Little Claus. "You threw me into the river about half an hour ago." "But wherever did you get all these fine beasts?" asked Great Claus. "These beasts are sea cattle," replied Little Claus. "I'll tell you the whole story, and thank you for drowning me. I am above you now. I am really very rich. I was frightened, to be sure, while I lay tied up in the sack, and the wind whistled in my ears when you threw me into the river from the bridge, and I sank to the bottom immediately. But I did not hurt myself, for I fell upon beautifully soft grass which grows down there, and in a moment the sack opened, and the sweetest little maiden came towards me. She had snow-white robes and a wreath of green leaves on her wet hair. She took me by the hand and said, "So you are come, Little Claus, and here are some cattle for you to begin with. About a mile farther on the road there is another herd for you." Then I saw that the river formed a great highway for the people who live in the sea. They were walking and driving here and there from the sea to the land at the spot where the river terminates. The bed of the river was covered with the loveliest flowers and sweet fresh grass. The fish swam past me as rapidly as the birds do here in the air. How handsome all the people were, and what fine cattle were grazing on the hills and in the valleys. "But why did you come up again?" said Great Claus. "If it was all so beautiful down there, I should not have done so." "Well," said Little Claus, "it was good policy on my part. You heard me say just now that I was told by the sea maiden to go a mile farther on the road, and I should find a whole herd of cattle. By the road she meant the river, for she could not travel any other way. But I knew the winding of the river and how it bends, sometimes to the right and sometimes to the left, and it seemed a long way. so I chose a shorter one. And by coming up to the land, and then driving across the fields back again to the river, I shall save half a mile, and get all my cattle more quickly." "What a lucky fellow you are!" exclaimed Great Claus. "Do you think I should get any sea cattle if I went down to the bottom of the river?" "Yes, I think so," said Little Claus, "but I cannot carry you there in a sack. You are too heavy. However, if you will go there first, and then creep into a sack, I will throw you in with the greatest pleasure." "Thank you," said Great Claus, "but remember, if I do not get any sea cattle down there, I shall come up again and give you a good thrashing." "No, now, don't be too fierce about it," said Little Claus, as they walked on towards the river. When they approached it, the cattle, who were very thirsty, saw the stream and ran down to drink. "See what a hurry they are in," said Little Claus. "They are longing to get down again." "Come, help me, make haste," said Great Claus, "or you'll get beaten." So he crept into a large sack, which had been lying across the back of one of the oxen. "Put in a stone," said Great Claus, "or I may not sink." "Oh, there's not much fear of that," he replied. Still he put a large stone into the bag, and then tied it tightly and gave it a push. Plump! In went Great Claus, and immediately sank to the bottom of the river. "I'm afraid he will not find any cattle," said Little Claus, and then he drove his own beasts homewards. "It'll Ida's flaws. My poor flowers are quite dead," said little Ida. "They were so pretty yesterday evening, and now all the leaves are hanging down quite withered." "What do they do that for?" she asked of the student who sat on the sofa. She liked him very much. He could tell the most amusing stories, and cut out the prettiest pictures, hearts and ladies dancing, castles with doors that opened, as well as flowers. He was a delightful student. "Why do the flowers look so faded today?" she asked again, and pointed to her nosegay, which was quite withered. "Don't you know what is the matter with them?" said the student. "The flowers were at a ball last night, and therefore it is no wonder they hang their heads." "But flowers cannot dance?" cried little Ida. "Yes, indeed they can," replied the student. "When it grows dark and everybody is asleep, they jump about quite merrily. They have a ball almost every night." "Can children go to these balls?" "Yes," said the student, "little daisies and lilies of the valley." "Where do the beautiful flowers dance?" asked little Ida. "Have you not often seen the large castle outside the gates of the town, where the king lives in summer, and where the beautiful garden is full of flowers? And have you not fed the swans with bread when they swam towards you?" "Well, the flowers have capital balls there, believe me." "I was in the garden out there yesterday with my mother," said Ida, "but all the leaves were off the trees, and there was not a single flower left." "Where are they? I used to see so many in the summer." "They are in the castle," replied the student. "You must know that as soon as the king and all the court are gone into the town, the flowers run out of the garden into the castle, and you should see how merry they are. The two most beautiful roses seat themselves on the throne, and are called the King and Queen. Then all the red coxcombs range themselves on each side and bow. These are the lords in waiting. After that the pretty flowers come in, and there is a grand ball. The blue violets represent little naval cadets, and dance with hyacinths and crocuses, which they call young ladies. The tulips and tiger lilies are the old ladies who sit and watch the dancing, so that everything may be conducted with order and propriety." "But," said little Ida, "is there no one there to hurt the flowers for dancing in the king's castle?" "No one knows anything about it," said the student. "The old steward of the castle, who has to watch there at night, sometimes comes in, But he carries a great bunch of keys, and as soon as the flowers hear the keys rattle, they run and hide themselves behind the long curtains and stand quite still, just peeping their heads out. Then the old steward says, "I smell flowers here, but he cannot see them." "Oh, how capital!" said little Ida, clapping her hands. "Should I be able to see these flowers?" "Yes," said the student. "Mind you think of it. The next time you go out, no doubt you will see them, if you'll peep through the window." I did so today, and I saw a long yellow lily lying stretched out on the sofa. She was a court lady. "Can the flowers from the botanical gardens go to these balls?" asked Ida. "It is such a distance." "Oh, yes," said the student, "whenever they like, for they can fly. Have you not seen those beautiful red, white, and yellow butterflies that look like flowers? They were flowers once. They have flown off their stalks into the air and flapped their leaves as if they were little wings to make them fly. Then, if they behave well, they obtain permission to fly about during the day instead of being obliged to sit still on their stems at home, and so in time their leaves become real wings. It may be, however, that the flowers in the botanical gardens have never been to the king's palace, and, therefore, they know nothing of the merry doings at night which take place there. I will tell you what to do, and the botanical professor, who lives close by here, will be so surprised. You know him very well, do you not? Well, next time you go into his garden, you must tell one of the flowers that there is going to be a grand ball at the castle. Then that flower will tell all the others, and they will fly away to the castle as soon as possible. And when the professor walks into his garden, there will not be a single flower left. How he will wonder what has become of them. But how can one flower tell another? Flowers cannot speak." "No, certainly not," replied the student, "but they can make signs. Have you not often seen that when the wind blows they nod at one another and rustle all their green leaves?" "Can the professor understand the signs?" asked Ida. "Yes, to be sure he can." He went one morning into his garden and saw a stinging nettle making signs with its leaves to a beautiful red carnation. It was saying, "You are so pretty. I like you very much." But the professor did not approve of such nonsense, so he clapped his hands on the nettle to stop it. Then the leaves, which are its fingers, stung him so sharply that he has never ventured to touch a nettle since. "Oh, how funny," said Ida, and she laughed. "How can anyone put such notions into a child's head?" said a tiresome lawyer who had come to pay a visit and sat on the sofa. He did not like the student, and would grumble when he saw him cutting out droll or amusing pictures. Sometimes it would be a man hanging on a gibbet and holding a heart in his hand, as if he had been stealing hearts. Sometimes it was an old witch riding through the air on a broom and carrying her husband on her nose. But the lawyer did not like such jokes, and he would say, as he had just said, "How can anyone put such nonsense into a child's head? What absurd fancies there are!" But to little Ida, all these stories which the student told her about the flowers seemed very droll, and she thought over them a great deal. The flowers did hang their heads, because they had been dancing all night and were very tired, and most likely they were ill. Then she took them into the room where a number of toys lay on a pretty little table, and the whole of the table drawer besides was full of beautiful things. Her doll Sophie lay in the doll's bed asleep, and little Ida said to her, "You must really get up, Sophie, and be content to lie in the drawer tonight. The poor flowers are ill, and they must lie in your bed. Then perhaps they will get well again." So she took the doll out, who looked quite cross, and said not a single word, for she was angry at being turned out of her bed. Ida placed the flowers in the doll's bed and drew the quilt over them. Then she told them to lie quite still and be good, while she made some tea for them, so that they might be quite well and able to get up the next morning. And she drew the curtains close round the little bed, so that the sun might not shine in their eyes. During the whole evening she could not help thinking of what the student had told her, and before she went to bed herself, she was obliged to peep behind the curtains into the garden where all her mother's beautiful flowers grew, hyacinths and tulips and many others. Then she whispered to them quite softly, "I know you are going to a ball tonight." But the flowers appeared as if they did not understand, and not a leaf moved. Still, Ida felt quite sure she knew all about it. She lay awake a long time after she was in bed, thinking how pretty it must be to see all the beautiful flowers dancing in the king's garden. "I wonder if my flowers have really been there," she said to herself, and then she fell asleep. In the night she awoke. She had been dreaming of the flowers and of the student, as well as of the tiresome lawyer who found fault with him. It was quite still in Ida's bedroom. The night lamp burnt on the table, and her father and mother were asleep. "I wonder if my flowers are still lying in Sophie's bed," she thought to herself. "How much I should like to know." She raised herself a little, and glanced at the door of the room where all her flowers and playthings lay. It was partly open, and as she listened, it seemed as if someone in the room was playing the piano, but softly and more prettily than she had ever before heard it. "Now all the flowers are certainly dancing in there," she thought. "Oh, how much I should like to see them!" But she did not dare move for fear of disturbing her father and mother. "If they would only come in here," she thought, but they did not come, and the music continued to play so beautifully and was so pretty that she could resist no longer. She crept out of her little bed, went softly to the door, and looked into the room. Oh, what a splendid sight there was, to be sure! There was no night lamp burning, but the room appeared quite light, for the moon shone through the window upon the floor and made it almost like day. All the hyacinths and tulips stood in 2 long rows down the room. Not a single flower remained in the window, and the flower pots were all empty. The flowers were dancing gracefully on the floor, making turns and holding each other by their long green leaves as they swung round. At the piano sat a large yellow lily, which little Ida was sure she had seen in the summer, for she remembered the student saying she was very much like Miss Lena, one of Ida's friends. They all laughed at him then, but now it seemed to little Ida as if the tall yellow flower was really like the young lady. She had just the same manners while playing, bending her long yellow face from side to side and nodding in time to the beautiful music. Then she saw a large purple crocus jump into the middle of the table where the playthings stood, go up to the doll's bedstead and draw back the curtains. There lay the sick flowers, but they got up directly and nodded to the others as a sign that they wished to dance with them. The old rough doll, with the broken mouth, stood up and bowed to the pretty flowers. They did not look ill at all now, but jumped about and were very merry. Yet none of them noticed little Ida. Presently it seemed as if something fell from the table. Ida looked that way, and saw a slight carnival rod jumping down among the flowers as if it belonged to them. It was, however, very smooth and neat, and a little wax doll with a broad-brimmed hat on her head, like the one worn by the lawyer, sat upon it. The carnival rod hopped about among the flowers on its 3 red-stilted feet, and stamped quite loud when it danced. The mazurka. The flowers could not perform this dance. They were too light to stamp in that manner. All at once the wax doll which rode on the carnival rod seemed to grow larger and taller, and it turned round and said to the paper flowers, "How can you put such things in a child's head? They are all foolish fancies." And then the doll was exactly like the lawyer with the broad-brimmed hat, and looked as yellow and as cross as he did. but the paper dolls struck him on his thin legs, and he shrunk up again and became quite a little wax doll. This was very amusing, and Ida could not help laughing. The carnival rod went on dancing, and the lawyer was obliged to dance also. It was no use. He might make himself great and tall, or remain a little wax doll with a large black hat. Still, he must dance. Then, at last, the other flowers interceded for him, especially those who had lain in the doll's bed, and the carnival rod gave up his dancing. At the same moment, a loud knocking was heard in the drawer, where Ida's doll Sophie lay with many other toys. Then the rough doll ran to the end of the table, laid himself flat down upon it, and began to pull the drawer out a little way. Then Sophie raised himself and looked round quite astonished. "There must be a ball here tonight," said Sophie. "Why did not somebody tell me?" "Will you dance with me?" said the rough doll. "You are the right sort to dance with, certainly," said she, turning her back upon him. Then she seated herself on the edge of the drawer and thought that perhaps one of the flowers would ask her to dance, but none of them came. Then she coughed. "Ha, ha, 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 hem, hem." But for all that, not one came. The shabby doll now danced quite alone, and not very badly after all. As none of the flowers seemed to notice Sophie, she let herself down from the drawer to the floor, so as to make a very great noise. All the flowers came round her directly, and asked if she had hurt herself, especially those who had lain in her bed. But she was not hurt at all, and Ida's flowers thanked her for the use of the nice bed, and were very kind to her. They led her into the middle of the room, where the moon shone, and danced with her, while all the other flowers formed a circle round them. Then Sophie was very happy, and said they might keep her bed. She did not mind lying in the drawer at all. But the flowers thanked her very much, and said, "We cannot live long. Tomorrow morning we shall be quite dead, and you must tell little Ida to bury us in the garden. Near to the grave of the canary, then, in the summer, we shall wake up and be more beautiful than ever." "No, you must not die," said Sophie, as she kissed the flowers. Then the door of the room opened, and a number of beautiful flowers danced in. Ida could not imagine where they could come from, unless they were the flowers from the king's garden. First came 2 lovely roses, with little golden crowns on their heads. These were the king and queen. Beautiful stocks and carnations followed, bowing to everyone present. They had also music with them. Large poppies and peonies had pea shells for instruments, and blew into them till they were quite red in the face. The bunches of blue hyacinths and the little white snowdrops jingled their bell-like flowers as if they were real bells. Then came many more flowers, blue violets, purple heart's ease, daisies, and lilies of the valley, and they all danced together and kissed each other. It was very beautiful to behold. At last the flowers wished each other good night. Then little Ida crept back into her bed again and dreamt of all she had seen. When she arose the next morning, she went quickly to the little table to see if the flowers were still there. She drew aside the curtains of the little bed. There they all lay, but quite faded, much more so than the day before. Sophie was lying in the drawer where Ida had placed her, but she looked very sleepy. "Do you remember what the flowers told you to say to me?" said little Ida, but Sophie looked quite stupid and said not a single word. "You are not kind at all," said Ida, "and yet they all danced with you." Then she took a little paper box on which were painted beautiful birds and laid the dead flowers in it. "This shall be your pretty coffin," she said, "and by, when my cousins come to visit me, they shall help me to bury you out in the garden, so that next summer you may grow up again more beautiful than ever." Her cousins were 2 good-tempered boys, whose names were James and Adolphus. Their father had given them each a bow and arrow, and they had brought them to show Ida. She told them about the poor flowers which were dead, and as soon as they obtained permission, they went with her to bury them. The two boys walked first, with their crossbows on their shoulders, and little Ida followed, carrying the pretty box containing the dead flowers. They dug a little grave in the garden. Ida kissed her flowers and then laid them, with the box, in the earth. James and Adolphus then fired their crossbows over the grave, as they had neither guns nor cannons. Little Tiny or Thumbelina. There was once a woman who wished very much to have a little child, but she could not obtain her wish. At last she went to a fairy and said, "I should so very much like to have a little child. Can you tell me where I can find one?" "Oh, that can be easily managed," said the fairy. "Here is a barley corn of a different kind to those which grow in the farmer's fields, and which the chickens eat. Put it into a flower pot, and see what will happen." "Thank you," said the woman, and she gave the fairy 12 shillings, which was the price of the barley corn. Then she went home and planted it, and immediately there grew up a large, handsome flower, something like a tulip in appearance, but with its leaves tightly closed, as if it were still a bud. "It is a beautiful flower," said the woman, and she kissed the red and golden-coloured leaves, and while she did so, the flower opened, and she could see that it was a real tulip. Within the flower, upon the green velvet stamens, sat a very delicate and graceful little maiden. She was scarcely half as long as a thumb, and they gave her the name of Thumbelina, or Tiny, because she was so small. A walnut shell, elegantly polished, served her for a cradle. Her bed was formed of blue-violet leaves, with a rose leaf for a counterpane. Here she slept at night, but during the day she amused herself on a table, where the woman had placed a plateful of water. Round this plate were wreaths of flowers with their stems in the water, and upon it floated a large tulip leaf, which served Tiny for a boat. Here the little maiden sat and rowed herself from side to side with 2 oars made of white horsehair. It really was a very pretty sight. Tiny could also sing so softly and sweetly that nothing like her singing had ever before been heard. One night, while she lay in her pretty bed, a large, ugly, wet toad crept through a broken pane of glass in the window and leaped right upon the table where Tiny lay sleeping under her rose-leaf quilt. "What a pretty little wife this would make for my son," said the toad, and she took up the walnut shell in which little Tiny lay asleep, and jumped through the window with it into the garden. In the swampy margin of a broad stream in the garden lived the toad with her son. He was uglier even than his mother, and when he saw the pretty little maiden in her elegant bed, he could only cry, "Croak, croak, croak." "Don't speak so loud, or she will wake," said the toad, "and then she might run away, for she is as light as swan's down. We will place her on one of the water-lily leaves out in the stream. It will be like an island to her. She is so light and small, and then she cannot escape, and, while she is away, we will make haste and prepare the state-room under the marsh, in which you are to live when you are married." Far out in the stream grew a number of water-lilies, with broad green leaves which seemed to float on the top of the water. The largest of these leaves appeared farther off than the rest, and the old toad swam out to it with the walnut shell, in which little Tiny lay still asleep. The tiny little creature woke very early in the morning, and began to cry bitterly when she found where she was, for she could see nothing but water on every side of the large green leaf, and no way of reaching the land. Meanwhile the old toad was very busy under the marsh, decking her room with rushes and wild yellow flowers, to make it look pretty for her new daughter-in-law. Then she swam out with her ugly son to the leaf on which she had placed poor little Tiny. She wanted to fetch the pretty bed, that she might put it in the bridal chamber to be ready for her. The old toad bowed low to her in the water and said, "Here is my son. He will be your husband, and you will live happily in the marsh by the stream." Croak, croak, croak was all her son could say for himself. So the toad took up the elegant little bed and swam away with it, leaving Tiny all alone on the green leaf, where she sat and wept. She could not bear to think of living with the old toad and having her ugly son for a husband. The little fishes, who swam about in the water beneath, had seen the toad and heard what she said, so they lifted their heads above the water to look at the little maiden. As soon as they caught sight of her, they saw she was very pretty, and it made them very sorry to think that she must go and live with the ugly toads. No, it must never be. So they assembled together in the water round the green stalk which held the leaf on which the little maiden stood, and gnawed it away at the root with their teeth. Then the leaf floated down the stream, carrying Tiny far away out of reach of land. Tiny sailed past many towns, and the little birds in the bushes saw her and sang, "What a lovely little creature!" So the leaf swam away with her farther and farther, till it brought her to other lands. A graceful little white butterfly constantly fluttered round her, and at last alighted on the leaf. Tiny pleased him, and she was glad of it. For now the toad could not possibly reach her, and the country through which she sailed was beautiful, and the sun shone upon the water till it glittered like liquid gold. She took off her girdle and tied one end of it round the butterfly, and the other end of the ribbon she fastened to the leaf, which now glided on much faster than ever, taking little Tiny with it as she stood. Presently a large cockchafer flew by. The moment he caught sight of her, he seized her round her delicate waist with his claws and flew with her into a tree. The green leaf floated away on the brook, and the butterfly flew with it, for he was fastened to it and could not get away. Oh, how frightened little Tiny felt when the cockchafer flew with her to the tree! But especially was she sorry for the beautiful white butterfly which she had fastened to the leaf, for if he could not free himself, he would die of hunger. But the cockchafer did not trouble himself at all about the matter. He seated himself by her side on a large green leaf, gave her some honey from the flowers to eat, and told her she was very pretty, though not in the least like a cockchafer. After a time, all the cockchafers turned up their feelers and said, "She has only 2 legs. How ugly that looks!" "She has no feelers," said another. "Her waist is quite slim. Pooh, she is like a human being." "Oh, she is ugly," said all the lady cockchafers, although Tiny was very pretty. Then the cockchafer who had run away with her believed all the others when they said she was ugly, and would have nothing more to say to her, and told her she might go where she liked. Then he flew down with her from the tree, and placed her on a daisy, and she wept at the thought that she was so ugly that even the cockchafers would have nothing to say to her. And all the while she was really the loveliest creature that one could imagine, and as tender and delicate as a beautiful rose leaf. During the whole summer, poor little Tiny lived quite alone in the wide forest. She wove herself a bed with blades of grass and hung it up under a broad leaf to protect herself from the rain. She sucked the honey from the flowers for food and drank the dew from their leaves every morning. So passed away the summer and the autumn, and then came the winter, the long, cold winter. All the birds who had sung to her so sweetly were flown away, and the trees and the flowers had withered. The large clover leaf under the shelter of which she had lived was now rolled together and shriveled up. Nothing remained but a yellow, withered stalk. She felt dreadfully cold, for her clothes were torn, and she was herself so frail and delicate that poor little Tiny was nearly frozen to death. It began to snow too, and the snowflakes as they fell upon her, were like a whole shovelful falling upon one of us, for we are tall, but she was only an inch high. Then she wrapped herself up in a dry leaf, but it cracked in the middle and could not keep her warm, and she shivered with cold. Near the wood in which she had been living lay a cornfield, but the corn had been cut a long time. Nothing remained but the bare, dry stubble standing up out of the frozen ground. It was to her like struggling through a large wood. Oh, how she shivered with the cold! She came at last to the door of a field mouse, who had a little den under the corn stubble. There dwelt the field mouse in warmth and comfort, with a whole roomful of corn, a kitchen, and a beautiful dining room. Poor little Tiny stood before the door, just like a little beggar girl, and begged for a small piece of barleycorn, for she had been without a morsel to eat for 2 days. "You poor little creature," said the field mouse, who was really a good old field mouse, "come into my warm room and dine with me." She was very pleased with Tiny, so she said, "You are quite welcome to stay with me all the winter, if you like, but you must keep my rooms clean and neat and tell me stories, for I shall like to hear them very much." And Tiny did all the field mouse asked her, and found herself very comfortable. "We shall have a visitor soon," said the field mouse one day. "My neighbor pays me a visit once a week. He is better off than I am. He has large rooms and wears a beautiful black velvet coat. If you could only have him for a husband, you would be well provided for indeed. But he is blind, so you must tell him some of your prettiest stories." But Tiny did not feel at all interested about this neighbor, for he was a mole. However, he came and paid his visit, dressed in his black velvet coat. "He is very rich and learned, and his house is 20 times larger than mine," said the field mouse. "He was rich and learned, no doubt, but he always spoke slightingly of the sun and the pretty flowers, because he had never seen them. Tiny was obliged to sing to him, 'Ladybird, ladybird, fly away home,' and many other pretty songs. And the mole fell in love with her because she had such a sweet voice. But he said nothing yet, for he was very cautious. A short time before, the mole had dug a long passage under the earth which led from the dwelling of the field mouse to his own, and here she had permission to walk with Tiny whenever she liked. But he warned them not to be alarmed at the sight of a dead bird which lay in the passage. It was a perfect bird, with a beak and feathers, and could not have been dead long, and was lying just where the mole had made his passage. The mole took a piece of phosphorescent wood in his mouth, and it glittered like fire in the dark. Then he went before them to light them through the long, dark passage. When they came to the spot where lay the dead bird, the mole pushed his broad nose through the ceiling. The earth gave way, so that there was a large hole, and the daylight shone into the passage. In the middle of the floor lay a dead swallow, his beautiful wings pulled close to his sides, his feet and his head drawn up under his feathers. The poor bird had evidently died of the cold. It made little Tiny very sad to see it. She did so love the little birds. All the summer they had sung and twittered for her so beautifully. But the mole pushed it aside with his crooked legs and said, "He will sing no more now. How miserable it must be to be born a little bird! I am thankful that none of my children will ever be birds, for they can do nothing but cry, tweet, tweet, and always die of hunger in the winter." "Yes, you may well say that as a clever man," exclaimed the field mouse. "What is the use of his twittering? For when winter comes he must either starve or be frozen to death. Still, birds are very high-bred." Tiny said nothing, but when the 2 others had turned their backs on the bird, she stooped down and stroked aside the soft feathers which covered the head, and kissed the closed eyelids. "Perhaps "This was the one who sang to me so sweetly in the summer," she said, "and how much pleasure it gave me, you dear pretty bird." The mole now stopped up the hole through which the daylight shone, and then accompanied the lady home. But during the night, Tiny could not sleep, so she got out of bed and wove a large, beautiful carpet of hay. Then she carried it to the dead bird and spread it over him, with some down from the flowers which she had found in the field. Mouse's room. It was as soft as wool, and she spread some of it on each side of the bird, so that he might lie warmly in the cold earth. "Farewell, you pretty little bird," said she. "Farewell. Thank you for your delightful singing during the summer, when all the trees were green and the warm sun shone upon us." Then she laid her head on the bird's breast, but she was alarmed immediately, for it seemed as if something inside the bird went thump, thump. It was the bird's heart. He was not really dead, only benumbed with the cold, and the warmth had restored him to life. In autumn, all the swallows fly away into warm countries, but if one happens to linger, the cold seizes it, it becomes frozen, and falls down as if dead. It remains where it fell, and the cold snow covers it. Tiny trembled very much. She was quite frightened, for the bird was large. A great deal larger than herself. She was only an inch high. But she took courage, laid the wool more thickly over the poor swallow, and then took a leaf which she had used for her own counterpane and laid it over the head of the poor bird. The next morning she again stole out to see him. He was alive, but very weak. He could only open his eyes for a moment to look at Tiny, who stood by holding a piece of decayed wood in her hand, for she had no other lantern. "Thank you, pretty little maiden," said the sick swallow. "I have been so nicely warmed that I shall soon regain my strength and be able to fly about again in the warm sunshine." "Oh," said she, "it is cold out of doors now. It snows and freezes. Stay in your warm bed. I will take care of you." Then she brought the swallow some water in a flower leaf, and after he had drank, he told her that he had wounded one of his wings in a thorn bush, and could not fly as fast as the others, who were soon far away on their journey to warm countries. Then at last he had fallen to the earth, and could remember no more, nor how he came to be where she had found him. The whole winter the swallow remained underground, and Tiny nursed him with care and love. Neither the mole nor the field mouse knew anything about it, for they did not like swallows. Very soon the springtime came, and the sun warmed the earth. Then the swallow bade farewell to Tiny, and she opened the hole in the ceiling which the mole had made. The sun shone in upon them so beautifully that the swallow asked her if she would go with him. She could sit on his back, he said, and he would fly away with her into the green woods. But Tiny knew it would make the field mouse very grieved if she left her in that manner, so she said, "No, I cannot." "Farewell, then, farewell, you good, pretty little maiden," said the swallow, and he flew out into the sunshine. Tiny looked after him, and the tears rose in her eyes. She was very fond of the poor swallow. "Tweet, tweet," sang the bird, as he flew out into the green woods, and Tiny felt very sad. She was not allowed to go out into the warm sunshine. The corn which had been sown in the field over the house of the field mouse had grown up high into the air, and formed a thick wood to Tiny, who was only an inch in height. "You are going to be married, Tiny," said the field mouse. "My neighbor has asked for you. What good fortune for a poor child like you! Now we will prepare your wedding clothes. They must be both woolen and linen. Nothing must be wanting when you are the mole's wife." Tiny had to turn the spindle, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders who were to weave day and night. Every evening the mole visited her and was continually speaking of the time when the summer would be over. Then he would keep his wedding day with Tiny, but now the heat of the sun was so great that it burned the earth and made it quite hard, like a stone. As soon as the summer was over, the wedding should take place. But Tiny was not at all pleased, for she did not like the tiresome mole. Every morning, when the sun rose, and every evening when it went down, she would creep out at the door, and as the wind blew aside the ears of corn, so that she could see the blue sky, she thought how beautiful and bright it seemed out there, and wished so much to see her dear swallow again. But he never returned, for by this time he had flown far away into the lovely green forest. When autumn arrived, Tiny had her outfit quite ready, and the field mouse said to her, "In 4 weeks the wedding must take place." Then Tiny wept, and said she would not marry the disagreeable mole. "Nonsense," replied the field mouse. "Now don't be obstinate, or I shall bite you with my white teeth. He is a very handsome mole. The queen herself does not wear more beautiful velvets and furs. His kitchen and cellars are quite full. You ought to be very thankful for such good fortune." So the wedding day was fixed, on which the mole was to fetch Tiny away to live with him deep under the earth, and never again to see the warm sun, because he did not like it. The poor child was very unhappy at the thought of saying farewell to the beautiful sun, and as the field mouse had given her permission to stand at the door, she went to look at it once more. "Farewell, bright sun," she cried, stretching out her arm towards it, and then she walked a short distance from the house, for the corn had been cut, and only the dry stubble remained in the fields. "Farewell, farewell," she repeated, twining her arm round a little red flower that grew just by her side. "Greet the little swallow from me if you should see him again." Tweet, tweet, sounded over her head suddenly. She looked up, and there was the swallow himself flying close by. As soon as he spied Tiny, he was delighted, and then she told him how unwilling she felt to marry the ugly mole, and to live always beneath the earth, and never to see the bright sun any more. And as she told him, she wept. "Cold winter is coming," said the swallow, "and I am going to fly away into warmer countries. Will you go with me? You can sit on my back, and fasten yourself on with your sash. Then we can fly away from the ugly mole and his gloomy rooms, far away over the mountains, into warmer countries where the sun shines more brightly than here, where it is always summer, and the flowers bloom in greater beauty. Fly now with me, dear little Tiny. You saved my life when I lay frozen in that dark passage." "Yes, I will go with you," said Tiny, and she seated herself on the bird's back, with her feet on his outstretched wings, and tied her girdle to one of his strongest feathers. Then the swallow rose in the air and flew over forest and over sea, high above the highest mountains, covered with eternal snow. Tiny would have been frozen in the cold air, but she crept under the bird's warm feathers, keeping her little head uncovered, so that she might admire the beautiful lands over which they passed. At length they reached the warm countries, where the sun shines brightly, and the sky seems so much higher above the earth. Here, on the hedges and by the wayside, grew purple, green, and white grapes. Lemons and oranges hung from trees in the woods, and the air was fragrant with myrtles and orange blossoms. Beautiful children ran along the country lanes, playing with large, gay butterflies, and as the swallow flew farther and farther, every place appeared still more lovely. At last they came to a blue lake, and by the side of it, shaded by trees of the deepest green, stood a palace of dazzling white marble, built in the olden times. Vines clustered round its lofty pillars, and at the top were many swallows' nests, and one of these was the home of the swallow who carried Tiny. "This is my house," said the swallow, "but it would not do for you to live there. you would not be comfortable. You must choose for yourself one of those lovely flowers, and I will put you down upon it, and then you shall have everything that you can wish to make you happy." "That will be delightful," she said, and clapped her little hands for joy. A large marble pillar lay on the ground, which, in falling, had been broken into 3 pieces. Between these pieces grew the most beautiful large white flowers. So the swallow flew down with Tiny, and placed her on one of the broad leaves. But how surprised she was to see in the middle of the flower a tiny little man, as white and transparent as if he had been made of crystal. He had a gold crown on his head, and delicate wings at his shoulders, and was not much larger than Tiny herself. He was the angel of the flower, for a tiny man and a tiny woman dwell in every flower, and this was the king of them all. "Oh, how beautiful he is!" whispered Tiny to the swallow. The little prince was at first quite frightened at the bird, who was like a giant compared to such a delicate little creature as himself. But when he saw Tiny, he was delighted, and thought her the prettiest little maiden he had ever seen. He took the gold crown from his head and placed it on hers, and asked her name, and if she would be his wife and queen over all the flowers. This certainly was a very different sort of husband to the son of a toad or the mole. "With my black velvet and fur," so she said, "yes, to the handsome prince." Then all the flowers opened, and out of each came a little lady or a tiny lord, all so pretty it was quite a pleasure to look at them. Each of them brought Tiny a present, but the best gift was a pair of beautiful wings which had belonged to a large white fly, and they fastened them to Tiny's shoulders so that she might fly from flower to flower. Then there was much rejoicing, and the little swallow who sat above them in his nest was asked to sing a wedding song, which he did as well as he could, but in his heart he felt sad, for he was very fond of Tiny and would have liked never to part from her again. "You must not be called Tiny any more," said the spirit of the flowers to her. "It is an ugly name, and you are so very pretty. We will call you Maia." "Farewell, farewell," said the swallow, with a heavy heart, as he left the warm countries to fly back into Denmark. There he had a nest over the window of a house in which dwelt the writer of fairy tales. The swallow sang "Tweet, tweet," and from his song came the whole story. Little Tuk. Yes, they called him Little Tuk. But it was not his real name. He had called himself so before he could speak plainly, and he meant it for Charles. It was all very well for those who knew him, but not for strangers. Little Tuk was left at home to take care of his little sister, Gustava, who was much younger than himself, and he had to learn his lessons at the same time, and the 2 things could not very well be performed together. The poor boy sat there with his sister on his lap, and sung to her all the songs he knew, and now and then he looked into his geography lesson that lay open before him. By the next morning he had to learn by heart all the towns in Zealand, and all that could be described of them. His mother came home at last and took little Gustava in her arms. Then Tuk ran to the window and read so eagerly that he nearly read his eyes out, for it had become darker and darker every minute, and his mother had no money to buy a light. "There goes the old washerwoman up the lane," said the mother as she looked out of the window. "The poor woman can hardly drag herself along." And now she had to drag a pail of water from the well. "Be a good boy, Tuk, and run across and help the old woman, won't you?" So Tuk ran across quickly and helped her. But when he came back into the room it was quite dark, and there was not a word said about a light. So he was obliged to go to bed on his little truckle bedstead, and there he lay and thought of his geography lesson, and of Zealand, and of all the master had told him. He ought really to have read it over again, but he could not for want of light. So He put the geography book under his pillow, for he had heard that this was a great help towards learning a lesson, but not always to be depended upon. He still lay thinking and thinking, when all at once it seemed as if someone kissed him on his eyes and mouth. He slept, and yet he did not sleep, and it appeared as if the old washerwoman looked at him with kind eyes and said, "It would be a great pity if you did not know your lesson tomorrow morning. You helped me, and now I will help you, and Providence will always keep those who help themselves." And at the same time the book under Tuk's pillow began to move about. "Cluck, cluck, cluck," cried a hen as she crept towards him. "I am a hen from Choge." And then she told him how many inhabitants the town contained, and about a battle that had been fought there, which really was not worth speaking of. Crack, crack, down fell something. It was a wooden bird, the parrot, which is used as a target, as Prasto. He said there were as many inhabitants in that town as he had nails in his body. He was very proud, and said, "Thorsten lived close to me, and here I am now, quite comfortable." But now little Tuk was no longer in bed. All in a moment he found himself on horseback. Gallop, gallop, away he went, seated in front of a richly attired knight with a waving plume, who held him on the saddle. And so they rode through the wood by the old town of Wordingberg, which was very large and busy. The king's castle was surrounded by lofty towers, and radiant light streamed from all the windows. Within there were songs and dancing. King Waldemar and the young, gaily dressed ladies of the court were dancing together. Morning dawned, and as the sun rose, the whole city and the king's castle sank suddenly down together. One tower after another fell, till at last only one remained standing on the hill where the castle had formerly been. The town now appeared small and poor, and the schoolboys read in their books, which they carried under their arms, that it contained 2,000 inhabitants. But this was a mere boast, for it did not contain so many. And again little Tuk lay in his bed, scarcely knowing whether he was dreaming or not, for someone stood by him. "Tuk, little Tuk," said a voice. It was a very little person who spoke. He was dressed as a sailor, and looked small enough to be a middy, but he was not one. "I bring you many greetings from Kosor. It is a rising town full of life. It has steamships and mail coaches. In times past they used to call it ugly, but that is no longer true. I lie on the seashore," said Kosor. "I have high roads and pleasure gardens. I have given birth to a poet who was witty and entertaining, which they are not all. I once wanted to fit out a ship to sail round the world, but I did not accomplish it, though most likely I might have done so. But I am fragrant with perfume, for close to my gates most lovely roses bloom." Then before the eyes of little Tuk appeared a confusion of colours, red and green, but it cleared off, and he could distinguish a cliff close to the bay, the slopes of which were quite overgrown with verdure, and on its summit stood a fine old church with pointed towers. Springs of water flowed out of the cliff in thick waterspouts, so that there was a continual splashing. Close by sat an old king with a golden crown on his white head. This was King Hroar of the Springs, and near the springs stood the town of Roskilde, as it is called. Then all the kings and queens of Denmark went up the ascent to the old church, hand in hand, with golden crowns on their heads, while the organ played and the fountain sent forth jets of water. Little Tuk saw and heard it all. "Don't forget the names of these towns," said King Hroar. All at once everything vanished. But where? It seemed to him like turning over the leaves of a book. And now there stood before him an old peasant woman, who had come from Sorrowe, where the grass grows in the marketplace. She had a green linen apron thrown over her head and shoulders, and it was quite wet, as if it had been raining heavily. "Yes, that it has," said she, and then, just as she was going to tell him a great many pretty stories from Holberg's comedies, and about Waldemar and Absalom, she suddenly shrunk up together and wagged her head as if she were a frog about to spring. "Croak," she cried, "it is always wet," and as quiet as death in Sorway. Then little Tuk saw she was changed into a frog. "Croak, and again she was an old woman. One must dress according to the weather," said she. "It is wet, and my town is just like a bottle. By the cork we must go in, and by the cork we must come out again. In olden times I had beautiful fish, and now I have fresh, rosy-cheeked boys in the bottom of the bottle, and they learn wisdom, Hebrew and Greek." Croak. How it sounded like the cry of the frogs on the moor, or like the creaking of great boots when someone is marching. Always the same tone, so monotonous and wearing. That little Tuk at length fell fast asleep, and then the sound could not annoy him. But even in this sleep came a dream, or something like it. His little sister Gustava, with her blue eyes and fair curly hair, had grown up a beautiful maiden all at once, and without having wings she could fly. And they flew together over Zealand, over green forests and blue lakes. "Hark, so you hear the cock crow, little Tuk? Cock-a-doodle-doo. The fowls are flying out of Choge. You shall have a large farmyard. You shall never suffer hunger or want. The bird of good omen shall be yours, and you shall become a rich and happy man. Your house shall rise up like King Waldemar's towers, and shall be richly adorned with marble statues like those at Prastoe. Understand me well. Your name shall travel with fame round the world like the ship that was to sail from Corsor and at Roskilde. Don't forget the names of the towns. As King Hroar said, you shall speak well and clearly, little Tuk, and when at last you lie in your grave, you shall sleep peacefully as if I lay in Sorrowy," said little Tuk, awaking. It was bright daylight, and he could not remember his dream. But that was not necessary, for we are not to know what will happen to us in the future. Then he sprang out of bed quickly, and read over his lesson in the book, and knew it all at once quite correctly. The old washerwoman put her head in at the door, and nodded to him quite kindly, and said, "Many thanks, you good child, for your help yesterday. I hope all your beautiful dreams will come true." Little Tuk did not at all know what he had dreamt, but one above did.